London, 1815. Theodore Blackwood, the arrogant Duke of Ravenshollow, had never met a woman who could resist his charm or challenge his wit. So when his friend wagered £1,000 that he couldn't propose to the next woman entering the ballroom and receive acceptance, Theo smirked with supreme confidence. Enter Seraphina Ashworth, the sharp-tongued beauty who had refused 7 suitors. As they waltzed, his practiced seduction became something unexpected, something real. "Accept my waltz and you will be my wife," he declared before hundreds of witnesses. Her breathless yes should have been his triumph. Instead, when she vanished without a trace the very next morning, the Duke realized he had won a wager, but lost his heart. The crystal chandeliers of Ashworth House cast their golden glow upon the most glittering assembly London had seen this season, where silk gowns rustled against perfectly tailored evening coats, and the air hummed with whispered gossip and barely contained ambition. Theodore Blackwood, the Duke of Ravenshollow, stood near the marble columns that framed the grand ballroom, his imposing figure cutting a striking silhouette against the opulent backdrop of cream and gold. At 28, he possessed the kind of devastating handsomeness that had made countless debutantes swoon and their mothers scheme, with dark hair that caught the lamplight and grey eyes that seemed to see through every pretense society offered. Yet tonight, as he surveyed the assembly with his characteristic air of bored superiority, those same eyes held a coldness that had sent yet another hopeful young lady retreating to her chaperone's side, with tears threatening to spill down her flushed cheeks. Miss Penelope Hartford, barely 18 and possessed of a considerable fortune, had just endured what society whispers would later describe as a masterful display of ducal disdain. Her stammered attempt at conversation met with such cutting politeness that she might as well have been dismissed by royal decree. The Duke's reputation as both England's most eligible bachelor and its most impossible man had been earned through precisely such encounters, where his wit proved as sharp as his profile, and twice as dangerous to feminine sensibilities. Lord Alexander Whitmore, Theo's closest friend and frequent partner in society's more questionable entertainments, approached with 2 glasses of the finest champagne and an expression of mild reproach that did nothing to dim the amusement dancing in his blue eyes. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. A man of similar age but decidedly more amiable disposition, Alexander had long served as both conscience and co-conspirator to the Duke's various social transgressions, though tonight he seemed determined to assume the former role with unusual persistence. "You have just reduced poor Miss Hartford to tears," he observed, offering 1 glass to his friend while taking a position that allowed him to survey both Theo's reaction and the retreating figure of the unfortunate young lady. "The 3rd one this evening, if my count is correct, and we have barely progressed beyond the 2nd set. Perhaps you might consider tempering your legendary charm with a touch of actual civility." Theo accepted the champagne with the same languid grace he brought to everything, his lips curving in a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. Miss Hartford possessed the conversational skills of a particularly dim sheep, and the musical knowledge of a tone-deaf parrot, he replied, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those standing nearest while maintaining the appearance of private discourse. "I merely saved her the embarrassment of a longer acquaintance that would have revealed these deficiencies to a wider audience. Surely that qualifies as kindness rather than cruelty." His grey eyes swept the ballroom with practiced assessment, cataloguing the various young ladies who had already positioned themselves hopefully within his vicinity, each one armed with accomplishments that ranged from adequate to accomplished, but none possessing that indefinable quality that might actually capture his interest for longer than a single dance. Society credited him with impossible standards, and perhaps they were correct, though Theo preferred to think of his requirements as simply more discerning than those of lesser men who allowed themselves to be swayed by a pretty face or a substantial dowry without demanding the intelligence to make either truly worthwhile. Alexander studied his friend with the penetrating gaze of someone who had known him since their school days at Eton, and recognized the restlessness that lurked beneath the Duke's carefully constructed facade of supreme confidence. "You claim no woman could surprise you," he said slowly, his tone suggesting the beginning of one of those conversations that would either end in hilarity or disaster. "Yet you have danced with none this season, choosing instead to stand here like some sort of matrimonial prophet dispensing judgment upon the assembled hopefuls. Tell me, Ravenshollow, when did you become so certain of your own superiority that you forgot the possibility of being wrong about anything, particularly about the fairer sex?" The challenge hung in the air between them, weighted with years of friendship and the kind of intimate understanding that allowed Alexander to speak truths that no one else would dare voice to a duke, especially one with Theo's reputation for sharp retorts and sharper consequences for those who presumed too much upon his good nature. Theo's eyebrows rose with aristocratic disdain, though something in his expression suggested that his friend's words had struck closer to home than he cared to admit. "You suggest I lack confidence in my ability to charm the ladies, Whitmore," he drawled, setting down his champagne glass with deliberate care upon a nearby table where it caught the light like liquid amber. "An interesting theory from a man who has watched me refuse more proposals on behalf of eager mothers than most men receive in a lifetime. I simply prefer not to waste my time on endeavors where the outcome is predetermined and the company unstimulating. The very predictability of these events renders them tedious beyond description, which is why I attend purely as a matter of social obligation rather than personal inclination." Alexander's smile turned decidedly wicked, the expression of a man who had just conceived a plan that would either prove his point spectacularly or provide entertainment for the remainder of the evening, possibly both, if fortune favored his design. "Very well, then," he said, moving closer to ensure their conversation remained private despite the crowd that surrounded them. "If you are so certain of your irresistible appeal and your superior judgment of feminine nature, perhaps you would care to test that confidence with a small wager between friends. Nothing too dramatic, you understand, merely a friendly test of your legendary powers of seduction and your equally legendary ability to read character at first glance." Theo's interest sharpened visibly, the board mask slipping just enough to reveal the competitive spirit that had made him a formidable opponent at cards, horses, and every other pursuit where gentlemen tested their skills against one another in the name of sport and pride. "What manner of wager?" he asked, his voice dropping to match his friend's conspiratorial tone, while his eyes began to gleam with something that resembled genuine animation for the first time that evening. The prospect of a challenge, particularly one that would allow him to demonstrate his superior understanding of both human nature and social dynamics, was precisely the sort of stimulation his restless spirit craved after weeks of tedious social obligations and predictable encounters with London's matrimonial hopefuls. Alexander glanced around the ballroom as if selecting the perfect stage for his proposed drama, before returning his attention to his friend with an expression of elaborate casualness that fooled neither of them about the seriousness of his intent. "I wager £1,000 that you could not charm any woman in this ballroom into accepting a proposal of marriage within the span of a single dance," he declared, his words carefully chosen to strike at both Theo's pride and his purported expertise in matters of the heart. "Not just any woman, mind you, but the very next lady to enter this ballroom, whoever she might be, whether 18 or 80, beauty or antidote, fortune or pauper. One waltz, one proposal, and if she accepts, you win both the wager and the right to continue claiming your superiority over every other man in England when it comes to understanding the feminine mind." The terms of the wager seemed to hang in the perfumed air between them like a gauntlet thrown down in challenge, and Theo found himself studying his friend's face with new interest as he considered the implications of what had just been proposed. Alexander's confident expression suggested he believed he had constructed a trap that would finally humble the Duke's legendary arrogance, though Theo suspected his friend underestimated both his ability to charm and his willingness to employ whatever methods might be necessary to secure victory in any contest where his reputation was at stake. "Any woman," he repeated slowly, as if tasting the words and finding them to his liking despite their apparent danger. "The next woman to enter this ballroom, regardless of age, appearance, or social standing. One waltz, one proposal, and if she accepts, I claim both your £1,000 and the satisfaction of proving that your skepticism regarding my abilities is entirely misplaced." The prospect of such a definitive demonstration of his social superiority was tremendously appealing, particularly given the audience of London's elite, who would witness whatever transpired and carry the tale throughout society for months to come. Alexander nodded solemnly, though his eyes betrayed his certainty that he had created a situation where his friend's notorious pride would finally meet its match in the form of some unsuspecting lady who would have the good sense to refuse such an outrageous proposition from a virtual stranger, regardless of his title or reputation. "Precisely," he confirmed, extending his hand to seal their agreement in the time-honored fashion of gentlemen making foolish decisions that would provide entertainment for their friends and potential disaster for themselves. "One waltz, one proposal, and we shall see whether your confidence in your own irresistible appeal is justified, or merely the product of an overindulged ego that has never encountered genuine resistance to its demands." They shook hands with the gravity of men embarking upon a venture that might reshape their understanding of themselves and their place in the social order, though neither could have predicted how profoundly the events about to unfold would alter not just their friendship, but the very foundation upon which Theo had built his carefully constructed world of certainty and control. As if summoned by their agreement, the sound of arriving carriages echoed from the street beyond, and the footman stationed at the ballroom's entrance straightened in preparation for welcoming the evening's final guests, though none present could have imagined that among them would be a woman whose very presence would transform their casual wager into something far more dangerous than either had anticipated when they made their foolish agreement in the golden glow of Ashworth House's most magnificent evening. The great doors of the ballroom opened with ceremonial precision, as the footman's voice rang out clear and strong above the gentle murmur of conversation and the distant strains of the orchestra tuning their instruments for the next set. "Miss Seraphina Ashworth," he announced, his words carrying across the assembled company like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of awareness that spread through the crowd as hundreds of eyes turned toward the entrance where the evening's hostess made her belated appearance. Seraphina moved into the ballroom with the unconscious grace of a woman who had been raised to command such spaces, her figure elegant in a gown of midnight blue silk that seemed to capture and reflect the candlelight with each step, while her dark hair had been arranged in a style that was both fashionable and practical, suggesting a mind that valued substance over mere ornament, even in matters of personal appearance. At 24, she possessed the kind of beauty that grew more remarkable upon closer inspection rather than stunning at first glance, with intelligent hazel eyes that missed little of what transpired around her, and features that spoke of both strength of character and gentle refinement, though those who knew her best understood that beneath her ladylike exterior lay a will of iron and a determination that had sustained her family through the darkest period of their recent history. As the daughter of the late Earl of Ashworth, she had inherited not only his title's social obligations, but also the crushing debts and responsibilities that had come with his untimely death 3 years prior, leaving her to manage both a vast estate and an ailing mother while navigating the treacherous waters of society's expectations regarding unmarried ladies of noble birth. Her reputation as one of London's most eligible spinsters had been earned through her polite but firm refusal of 7 separate proposals from gentlemen whose offers had ranged from the sincere to the calculating, each one rejected not from caprice or impossible standards, but from her unwavering determination never to marry for any reason other than genuine affection and mutual respect, luxuries she could ill afford given her family's precarious financial situation, yet refused to sacrifice despite the increasingly desperate nature of their circumstances. She had spent the evening thus far attending to the countless details that ensured her guests' comfort and entertainment, from consulting with the cook regarding the midnight supper to resolving a minor crisis involving the floral arrangements, duties that had kept her from the ballroom proper until now, but had also provided her with ample opportunity to observe the assembled company from a distance and note the various dramas unfolding among London's social elite, including the Duke of Ravenshollow's apparently determined effort to discourage every young lady foolish enough to attempt conversation with him. Theo watched her approach with the calculating gaze of a predator who had just identified his quarry, though something in the way she moved through the crowd suggested this particular prey might prove more challenging than he had initially anticipated when he accepted Alexander's wager with such confident assurance. Miss Ashworth possessed a quality that set her apart from the usual run of society beauties, a self-possession that spoke of genuine accomplishment rather than mere social training, and as she paused to greet various guests with precisely the right combination of warmth and dignity, he found himself genuinely curious about what manner of woman could command such universal respect while maintaining her independence in a world that offered few rewards for unmarried ladies past their first youth. Her reputation for refusing proposals had reached even his ears, though he had dismissed such stories as the usual gossip that surrounded any woman of reasonable fortune and family who dared to exercise choice in matters of matrimony. Yet observing her now, he began to understand that perhaps there was more substance to those tales than he had previously credited to the accuracy of society's rumour mill. She moved with purpose rather than mere social obligation, her attention focused on ensuring her guests' pleasure rather than securing their admiration for herself. And when she smiled, it was with genuine warmth rather than the practiced charm that characterized most hostesses of his acquaintance, though he suspected that beneath that gracious exterior lay a keen intelligence that would not be easily deceived by flattery or impressed by title alone. Alexander nudged his friend's elbow with barely concealed glee as he observed the direction of Theo's attention and recognized the measuring look that had entered the Duke's grey eyes, the expression of a man who had just realized that his casual wager might require considerably more effort than he had originally anticipated to achieve the victory he had so confidently predicted. "There she is," he murmured, his voice rich with anticipation and not a little satisfaction at having engineered a situation that might finally challenge his friend's seemingly unlimited confidence in his own abilities where the opposite sex was concerned. "Miss Seraphina Ashworth, your intended victim in this evening's entertainment, though I suspect you may find her a more formidable opponent than the usual run of matrimonial hopefuls who swoon at your mere approach. She has, if memory serves, refused no fewer than 7 proposals from gentlemen of excellent family and substantial fortune, which suggests either impossibly high standards or a degree of independence that might not readily yield to even your considerable charm and elevated social position." Theo's smile widened as he absorbed this intelligence, finding the prospect of a genuine challenge infinitely more appealing than the easy conquest he had originally envisioned when accepting what had seemed like Alexander's poorly considered wager, though he was careful to maintain an expression of supreme confidence that betrayed none of his growing respect for the woman who would shortly find herself the object of his most concentrated attention. 7 refusals, he mused, adjusting his cuffs with the precision of a man preparing for battle, while his eyes never left Seraphina's graceful figure as she continued her progress through the ballroom. An impressive record of independence for any lady, though I suspect those 7 gentlemen simply lacked the proper combination of determination and technique required to breach such formidable defenses. Fortunately for the success of our wager, I possess both qualities in abundance, along with certain advantages of rank and person that should prove sufficient to accomplish what lesser men have failed to achieve through their obvious inadequacies of approach and appeal. His voice carried the lazy confidence of a man who had never encountered a social situation he could not master through the application of his natural gifts and aristocratic privilege, though something in the set of his shoulders suggested he understood that the next few minutes would require him to deploy both weapons with more skill and subtlety than any previous conquest had demanded of his abilities. Alexander watched his friend's preparations with the fascinated attention of a man who had just set in motion forces that might well exceed his control, though whether the ultimate result would prove his point about Theo's overweening pride or simply provide his friend with yet another opportunity to demonstrate his superior understanding of human nature remained to be seen as the Duke began his approach toward the unsuspecting Miss Ashworth, with all the deliberate intent of a master strategist, advancing upon a position he had determined to capture, regardless of the strength of its defenses or the skill of its commander. The moment had arrived for the evening's most dangerous game to begin, though neither participant yet understood how completely their casual encounter would transform not only the nature of their wager, but the very foundation of their understanding about love, pride, and the unpredictable power of genuine emotion to overthrow even the most carefully constructed plans for conquest and control, as Theo moved across the ballroom floor with the confident stride of a man who had never doubted his ability to achieve whatever goal he set himself, unaware that he was about to meet the one woman who could challenge every assumption he had ever made about his own invincibility in matters of the heart. The pale light of dawn crept through the heavy velvet curtains of Seraphina's bedchamber like an unwelcome intruder, casting long shadows across the Persian carpet and illuminating the disorder that marked the aftermath of her restless night, where sleep had proven as elusive as peace of mind in the wake of her shocking acceptance of the Duke of Ravenshollow's public proposal. She sat before her dressing-table mirror, still wearing the wrinkled blue silk gown from the previous evening, her dark hair tumbling loosely about her shoulders as she stared at her reflection with the horrified fascination of someone who no longer recognized the woman looking back at her from the silvered glass. The face that met her gaze appeared older somehow, marked by shadows beneath her hazel eyes and a tightness around her mouth that spoke of decisions made in passion rather than wisdom, choices that would reverberate through the remainder of her carefully ordered existence like ripples spreading across a previously calm pond. What had she done? She wondered with mounting desperation. Allowing emotion to override the careful reasoning that had guided every major decision of her adult life since assuming responsibility for her family's welfare following her father's untimely death 3 years prior. She had accepted the proposal of Theodore Blackwood, the Duke of Ravenshollow, a man whose reputation for casual cruelty toward the feminine portion of society was matched only by his legendary arrogance and his complete disdain for the institution of marriage that he had just manipulated her into accepting before the assembled cream of London's social elite. Every person present at last night's ball had witnessed her breathless yes to his shocking proposition, and by now the news would have spread through the drawing rooms and morning visits of Mayfair like wildfire through dried grass, carrying with it implications that would affect not only her own carefully guarded reputation, but the standing of her entire family in a society that showed little mercy to those who transgressed its unwritten rules of acceptable behavior. Her mother's illness had already made their position precarious, with creditors growing increasingly insistent about the mounting debts that threatened to consume what remained of the Ashworth estate. And now she had complicated their situation immeasurably by binding herself to a man who might well prove more interested in public humiliation than private happiness. A duke whose very presence in her life would subject every action to the most intense scrutiny from those who delighted in the downfall of their social betters. The worst part of her current predicament lay not in the practical consequences of her impulsive decision, but in the treacherous moment of connection she had experienced during their waltz, when something in his grey eyes had suggested depths beneath the polished surface of ducal arrogance, a vulnerability that had made her forget every sensible reason why accepting such a proposal would prove disastrous for everyone concerned. She had seen past the mask he wore so skillfully, glimpsed what might have been genuine feeling rather than mere performance, and that momentary softening had proven her undoing as surely as if he had cast some sort of enchantment over her usually reliable common sense and practical nature. Across Mayfair, in the masculine sanctuary of his private study at Ravenshollow House, Theodore Blackwood stood before the tall windows that overlooked the perfectly manicured gardens, still wearing the evening clothes from the previous night, though he had long since discarded his cravat and loosened his collar in a gesture that spoke of restlessness rather than relaxation, his dark hair dishevelled from running his hands through it during the sleepless hours since returning from Ashworth House. The morning light revealed the evidence of his disturbed night in the empty brandy glass that sat abandoned on his desk beside the unread correspondence that had accumulated during his absence, though even the finest French cognac had failed to provide either the celebration or the oblivion he had sought in the wake of his apparent victory over Alexander's seemingly impossible wager. He should have been savouring his triumph, he reflected with growing unease, having accomplished what his friend had declared impossible by securing an acceptance from a woman renowned for her refusal of 7 previous suitors. Yet instead of satisfaction, he found himself plagued by doubts that had nothing to do with his success, and everything to do with the manner in which that success had been achieved. The look in Seraphina's eyes when she had whispered her acceptance haunted him now in ways he had not anticipated when he approached their encounter as merely another opportunity to demonstrate his superior understanding of feminine nature and his ability to bend any situation to his will through the application of charm and aristocratic privilege. There had been something achingly genuine in her response that transcended the boundaries of their public performance, a tremor in her voice that suggested emotions far deeper than mere social politeness or strategic consideration of his advantageous offer, and the memory of that moment when their eyes had met during the waltz continued to disturb his usual equilibrium in ways that had nothing to do with the £1,000 he had won from his friend's misguided confidence in feminine resistance to ducal persuasion. Alexander had indeed congratulated him upon his return, settling the debt with good grace and considerable amusement at having been proven wrong about his friend's legendary powers of seduction. Yet even as Theo had accepted both payment and praise, he had found himself unable to share in the spirit of celebration that should have marked such a definitive demonstration of his social superiority over both his friend's skepticism and Miss Ashworth's supposedly impregnable defences against matrimonial pressure from unwelcome suitors. The victory felt hollow in ways he could not entirely explain, tainted by the growing suspicion that what had transpired between them during those brief moments on the dance floor had transcended the boundaries of mere performance and entered territory far more dangerous to his carefully maintained emotional detachment from the complications that genuine feeling inevitably brought to any relationship between men and women of their elevated social position. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside Serafina's chamber announced the arrival of her personal maid, followed almost immediately by the more deliberate tread that could only belong to Mrs. Minerva Ashworth, whose weakened physical condition had not diminished her formidable presence or her determination to address the crisis that had descended upon their household with her daughter's shocking acceptance of the Duke's public proposal. Serafina rose from her position before the mirror with reluctant resignation, recognizing in her mother's measured approach the signs of a conversation that would brook neither delay nor evasion, though she dreaded the necessity of explaining decisions that she herself barely understood in the clear light of morning's ruthless illumination of foolish choices made in emotional darkness. Mrs. Ashworth entered the chamber with the dignity of a woman who had once commanded the heights of social prominence and refused to allow either illness or reduced circumstances to diminish her natural authority, her silver hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour, and her pale blue eyes sharp with intelligence that missed little of her daughter's obvious distress or the implications of the evening's unexpected developments. "You have accepted Ravenshollow," she stated without preamble, settling herself in the chair beside the window with the careful movements of someone who conserved energy for battles that truly mattered, while her penetrating gaze never left her daughter's face. "The banns will be read in church come Sunday, and by Monday morning every household in London will know that Serafina Ashworth is to become the Duchess of Ravenshollow, a development that will surprise precisely no one who witnessed last evening's extraordinary display of public courtship and acceptance. There is no escape from this engagement, my dear child, unless you wish to be ruined entirely and drag our family's reputation down with your own, a consequence that would extend far beyond mere social embarrassment to include the complete destruction of any hope we might retain of preserving what remains of your father's estate from the creditors who grow more insistent with each passing month." Her words carried the weight of absolute certainty about the realities of their situation, though her tone held none of the reproach that Serafina had expected from a woman whose own marriage had been arranged for love rather than convenience, and who had hoped to see her daughter enjoy similar freedom in choosing her life's companion. Mrs. Ashworth had recognized long before her daughter the impossible position created by their mounting debts and declining social influence, understanding that marriage to a wealthy nobleman represented not merely personal salvation, but the only path toward preserving the estate and tenants who depended upon their family's continued stability for their own survival and prosperity. She had observed the Duke's behavior throughout the season with the calculating eye of a mother who understood that his apparent interest in Serafina, however it had manifested in last evening's shocking proposal, might represent their only opportunity to secure the financial security that had eluded them since her husband's death, left them with more obligations than resources to meet the crushing weight of aristocratic responsibility, in an era when landed wealth alone could no longer sustain the lifestyle expected of their elevated position in society's carefully maintained hierarchy. The interview that followed proved as difficult as Serafina had anticipated, with her mother's probing questions revealing the extent to which passion had overwhelmed prudence in her decision to accept a proposal that logic should have compelled her to refuse, regardless of the public embarrassment such rejection might have caused both parties involved in the evening's dramatic confrontation. Mrs. Ashworth listened with growing concern as her daughter attempted to explain the inexplicable moment of connection that had led to her breathless acceptance of a man whose character she barely knew beyond reputation and whose motives for making such a public gesture remained as mysterious as his true feelings toward the woman he had chosen to honor with his aristocratic attention. The practical consequences of the engagement dominated their discussion, from the necessity of announcing the betrothal in the proper newspapers to the arrangements required for a wedding that would satisfy both social expectations and their straitened financial circumstances, though underlying every practical consideration lay the unspoken question of whether genuine affection might develop between two people whose initial encounter had been marked more by challenge than by any conventional expression of romantic interest or compatible temperament. Mrs. Ashworth had survived long enough in the treacherous waters of high society to recognize the signs of a man who was accustomed to winning whatever game he chose to play. Yet she had also observed enough of human nature to suspect that the Duke's interest in her daughter might transcend mere conquest or casual entertainment, particularly given his reputation for avoiding matrimonial entanglements despite years of determined pursuit by ambitious mothers and their hopeful daughters. The very fact that he had chosen to propose so publicly suggested either supreme confidence in his reception or genuine emotion that had overcome his usual careful calculation. And while Mrs. Ashworth could not determine which explanation better fit the circumstances of their extraordinary courtship, she understood that her daughter's future happiness would depend upon discovering the truth behind his apparent transformation from confirmed bachelor to eager suitor in the space of a single evening's entertainment. Their conversation concluded with reluctant acceptance of the reality that bound them to a course of action that could lead either to unexpected felicity or complete disaster, depending upon factors that remained largely beyond their control as they prepared to navigate the complex negotiations that would determine the terms of an alliance between two proud families whose futures had become unexpectedly and irrevocably intertwined through the impulsive decisions of a single evening's passion and pride. The formal call that Theodore made upon the Ashworth household 2 days following their public engagement arrived with all the ceremony befitting a duke's courtship of an earl's daughter, though the emotional distance that characterized their second meeting stood in marked contrast to the electric connection that had sparked between them during their scandalous waltz at the ball, where their fate had been so publicly sealed. Seraphina received him in the morning-room with a composure that revealed none of the turmoil that had plagued her thoughts since accepting his proposal, her manner transformed from the passionate woman who had breathlessly whispered yes into something far cooler and more calculating. A lady determined to establish the practical boundaries of an arrangement that she now viewed as purely contractual rather than romantic in its fundamental nature. Her morning dress of pale green muslin was perfectly proper and utterly unrevealing of either figure or feeling, while her dark hair had been arranged in a style that emphasized efficiency rather than allure. Every detail of her appearance calculated to discourage the sort of intimate conversation that might complicate their necessarily business-like discussion of settlements and wedding plans. Theodore found himself both frustrated and fascinated by this dramatic transformation in the woman who had so completely captured his attention during their brief but memorable encounter on the dance floor, where her sparkling wit and evident intelligence had provided the first genuine challenge to his assumptions about feminine nature that he had encountered in years of disappointing interactions with society's matrimonial candidates. She outlined her terms for their union with the precision of a solicitor negotiating a commercial agreement, her voice steady and her manner professional as she described her expectations for a marriage of convenience that would satisfy social requirements while allowing both parties to maintain their independence in all matters beyond the necessary public appearances that would convince society of their contentment with the arrangement they had so impulsively entered during the previous week's entertainment. Her requirements included separate establishments within his various properties, minimal interaction beyond the formal obligations of their respective positions as Duke and Duchess, and complete freedom to pursue their individual interests without interference from or consultation with their matrimonial partner, conditions that would have suited his own preferences perfectly had he not found himself increasingly disturbed by the prospect of such emotional distance from a woman whose brief moments of vulnerability had revealed depths that he found himself eager to explore further, despite his usual preference for uncomplicated relationships with females who made no demands upon his time or attention beyond the purely physical satisfaction that could be obtained without emotional entanglement. Her icy demeanor during their interview served only to heighten his curiosity about the passionate nature she seemed determined to conceal beneath layers of proper behavior and practical consideration. While her obvious intelligence in matters of estate management and tenant welfare revealed an understanding of responsibility that matched his own commitment to the duties that came with hereditary privilege, though she seemed determined to prevent any personal connection that might complicate the purely formal alliance she was prepared to accept as the price of securing her family's financial stability and social position. During their conversation, he glimpsed the woman behind the mask when she spoke with evident love about her family's estate and the improvements she hoped to implement for the benefit of tenants whose welfare had become her primary concern since assuming management of properties that required constant attention to remain productive in an era of agricultural uncertainty and economic change. Her devotion to those who depended upon her family's stewardship revealed a character that transcended mere social obligation, demonstrating the sort of genuine concern for others that his own upbringing had taught him to value, even as his adult experience had led him to doubt its existence among the calculating members of their elevated social circle who too often confused genuine caring with strategic positioning for personal advancement. The morning edition of the Times carried the announcement that would set every drawing room in Mayfair ablaze with speculation and gossip, its formal phrasing utterly inadequate to convey the shock that rippled through London's most exclusive circles when they read that His Grace Theodore Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshollow, had the honour to announce his engagement to Miss Seraphina Ashworth, eldest daughter of the late Earl of Ashworth and Mrs. Minerva Ashworth of Grosvenor Square. Within hours of the paper's delivery, every household of consequence was buzzing with theories about how the season's most confirmed bachelor had been captured by a woman whose own reputation for refusing advantageous offers had made her something of a legend among the marriage-minded mothers who viewed her continued spinsterhood as both an inspiration and a cautionary tale about the dangers of being too particular in matters of matrimony. Lady Constance Pemberton, Sarah's dearest friend since their shared season 5 years prior, and a hopeless romantic whose own happy marriage had only intensified her belief in the transformative power of true love, arrived at the Ashworth residence before the morning was half spent. Her carriage wheels barely stopped turning before she was requesting immediate audience with the newly engaged Miss Ashworth, her blue eyes sparkling with curiosity and her round face flushed with excitement at being among the first to hear the details of what promised to be the most fascinating courtship story of the decade. Constance had observed the Duke's behavior toward other ladies throughout the season with the keen interest of someone who delighted in romantic intrigue, noting his apparent immunity to feminine charm and his devastating amoureux to discourage even the most determined pursuit from ambitious debutantes and their scheming mothers, which made his sudden transformation from matrimonial prize to eager suitor all the more remarkable and worthy of thorough investigation by those who claimed friendship with the fortunate lady who had somehow accomplished what every other woman in London had failed to achieve. She found Seraphina in the morning room, seated before her escritoire with correspondence spread before her in neat piles, the picture of composed efficiency that had always characterized her friend's approach to managing the countless details of estate business and social obligation, though Constance's experienced eye immediately detected the subtle signs of strain around Sarah's eyes that suggested the engagement had brought complications, along with congratulations from well-wishers who had no understanding of the true circumstances surrounding this unexpected alliance between two of society's most independent spirits. "My dearest Sarah," Constance exclaimed as she swept into the room with all the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered buried treasure, her morning dress of rose-colored silk rustling with each animated movement as she crossed the carpet to embrace her friend with genuine affection, tempered by burning curiosity about the romantic drama that had apparently unfolded right under the noses of an unsuspecting ton. "I have read the announcement 3 times, and can scarcely credit that you have accepted the Duke of Ravenshollow after refusing Lord Pembroke and Sir Reginald, and that dreadful Mr. Hartwell, who was so persistent last spring. Though I confess I am not entirely surprised, since I did notice him watching you rather intently during Lady Weatherby's musical evening last month, and there was something in his expression that suggested more than casual interest, despite his reputation for viewing marriage as a fate worse than social eggs or financial ruin. Seraphina received her friend's congratulations with the gracious composure she had perfected during years of managing social situations that required careful navigation between honesty and discretion, though she found herself struggling to maintain her usual equanimity under Constance's penetrating gaze and obvious expectation of romantic confidences that simply did not exist in the practical arrangement she had negotiated with her future husband. The story she offered was carefully constructed to satisfy curiosity without revealing the true nature of their understanding, emphasizing the practical advantages of the match while deflecting questions about romantic attachment with references to mutual respect and compatible temperaments that sounded appropriately matrimonial without committing her to claims about affection that she could not support with evidence from their brief and business-like courtship. "It is indeed a practical arrangement," she explained, with what she hoped was convincing sincerity. "One that serves both our families' interests while allowing us to maintain our respective independence in matters that do not directly concern our shared obligations as husband and wife. A modern approach to marriage that recognizes the benefits of partnership without demanding the sort of romantic passion that too often leads to disappointment when reality fails to match the expectations created by excessive sentiment and unrealistic hopes." Her words carried the measured tone of someone who had given considerable thought to justifying decisions that others might find difficult to understand, though she was careful to avoid any suggestion that the arrangement had been entered into reluctantly, or that she harbored doubts about its wisdom, despite the obvious haste with which the engagement had been concluded following their dramatic encounter at the Ashworth Ball, where their private drama had been played out before an audience of hundreds who would spend months speculating about the true nature of the courtship that had culminated in such a surprising announcement. Constance listened with growing bewilderment to this bloodless description of what should have been the most romantic period of her friend's life, her own happy memories of courtship and early marriage, making it difficult to comprehend how anyone could speak so dispassionately about accepting a proposal from one of England's most eligible bachelors, particularly one whose devastating handsomeness and considerable fortune should have inspired at least some degree of feminine flutter, even in someone as practical as Seraphina had always proven herself to be in matters of both heart and household management. Yet something in her friend's carefully controlled expression suggested that beneath the composed surface lay emotions far more complex than mere practical satisfaction with an advantageous match, and Constance found herself wondering what had really transpired during that brief waltz that had resulted in such a dramatically unexpected conclusion to the Duke's legendary resistance to matrimonial pressure, and Sarah's equally famous independence from masculine influence in all its various forms and manifestations. Meanwhile, at Ravenshollow House, Theodore faced his own interrogation from a quarter far more difficult to deflect with casual explanations and aristocratic authority, as his younger brother, Lord Percival Blackwood, had arrived unannounced from the ducal estates in Yorkshire with the obvious intention of discussing the engagement that had shocked him perhaps more than any other member of their immediate family circle. Percy possessed none of his older brother's easy charm or social graces, being instead a serious-minded man of 28 whose life had been devoted to the practical management of the vast properties that supported the Ravenshollow fortune, his days spent among ledgers and tenant meetings rather than ballrooms and gaming hells. Yet his lack of social polish was more than compensated by a shrewd understanding of both financial reality and human nature that made him invaluable to his brother's continued prosperity and social position. He had observed Theo's increasingly reckless behavior throughout the past year with growing concern, noting the mounting gambling debts that had been settled with increasing frequency, and the whispered conversations among creditors who had begun to question whether even the Duke of Ravenshollow's resources were infinite enough to support his current lifestyle without eventual consequence to the family's reputation and stability. Percy's arrival in London had been prompted not by curiosity about his brother's romantic affairs, but by reports from their steward about mysterious inquiries into the solvency of the Ravenshollow estates. Suggestions that someone was investigating the Duke's financial position with a thoroughness that implied either blackmail or marriage settlement negotiations, either possibility requiring immediate fraternal intervention to protect both their family's interests and their carefully maintained public image as members of England's most secure aristocratic houses. "Your reputation for recklessness is catching up with you," Percy stated without preamble, as he settled himself in his brother's study with the determined air of someone prepared to conduct a lengthy and possibly unpleasant conversation about matters that could no longer be avoided through charm or deflection, his plain brown coat and practical manner forming a stark contrast to Theo's elegant morning dress and casual sophistication. "Creditors whisper about the extent of your obligations. Marriage-minded mothers plot to compromise you into proposals their daughters cannot otherwise secure. And now this sudden engagement to Miss Ashworth seems suspiciously out of character for someone who has spent the past decade avoiding matrimonial entanglement with the determination of a man fleeing the plague, which leads me to wonder what circumstances have compelled you to abandon your legendary independence in favor of an alliance that appears to offer more complications than advantages to someone of your elevated position and established preferences." The conversation that followed proved as uncomfortable as Theo had anticipated from the moment he received word of his brother's unexpected arrival in London, with Percy's methodical questioning revealing the extent to which his recent behavior had attracted unwelcome attention from those who made their living by investigating the private affairs of wealthy noblemen for the benefit of clients whose motives were rarely benevolent or disinterested in their approach to gathering information about potential vulnerabilities among the upper classes. Theo found himself unable to explain the true circumstances of his engagement without revealing the wager that had prompted his proposal, an admission that would only confirm Percy's worst suspicions about his judgment and his fitness to manage both ducal responsibilities and personal relationships in a manner befitting their family's elevated status in society's carefully maintained hierarchy of wealth and influence. Instead, he offered vague references to mutual attraction and compatible temperaments, while emphasizing the practical advantages of an alliance with a family whose estate bordered their own properties and whose financial difficulties might be resolved through marriage to someone with sufficient resources to restore their former prosperity, explanations that satisfied neither his brother's concerns about his sudden transformation from confirmed bachelor to eager bridegroom, nor his own growing doubts about the wisdom of entering into marriage with a woman whose true feelings toward him remained as mysterious as his own confused emotions regarding their upcoming union. Percy listened with the patient attention of someone accustomed to detecting inconsistencies in financial reports and tenant complaints, his experienced ear catching the evasions and half-truths that characterized his brother's account of a courtship that had apparently progressed from first meeting to formal engagement in the span of a single evening's entertainment, a timeline that suggested either genuine passion or calculated desperation rather than the careful consideration that should characterize any decision with such far-reaching consequences for both personal happiness and family responsibility. The interview concluded with reluctant acceptance that the engagement could not be dissolved without scandal that would damage both families' reputations, though Percy's parting warnings about the need for greater discretion in future dealings with creditors and social obligations carried implications that Theo found increasingly difficult to dismiss as mere brotherly concern about his reputation for recklessness, suggesting instead that his financial position might be far more precarious than he had realized when accepting Alexander's seemingly innocent wager about his ability to charm any woman into accepting his proposal within the span of a single dance, a challenge that had seemed like harmless entertainment until its success had bound him to consequences that extended far beyond the simple matter of winning £1,000 from his overconfident friend, who had underestimated both his determination and his skill in matters of romantic conquest. Though the ultimate cost of that victory remained to be calculated as he prepared to navigate the treacherous waters of a marriage that had begun as performance and might yet transform into something far more dangerous to his carefully maintained emotional independence from the complications that genuine feeling inevitably brought to any relationship between equals who possessed both the intelligence and the pride necessary to challenge each other's most fundamental assumptions about love, marriage, and the possibility of finding happiness within the constraints imposed by society's expectations and their own carefully constructed defenses against the vulnerability that true intimacy demanded from those brave enough or foolish enough to risk everything for the chance of discovering whether passion might prove stronger than pride in the eternal struggle between heart and mind that had challenged lovers since the beginning of time itself and showed no signs of resolution in the present case of two people whose initial encounter had been marked more by mutual challenge than conventional romantic interest, leaving both participants uncertain whether their upcoming marriage would prove to be salvation or disaster for all concerned, as they struggled to understand emotions that defied rational analysis or practical categorization within the neat boundaries of social convention and aristocratic expectation regarding the proper conduct of matrimonial alliances between members of England's most elevated families and their carefully maintained positions within the complex hierarchy that governed every aspect of their public and private lives in an era when individual happiness remained subordinate to family duty and social obligation, in all matters of genuine importance to their continued prosperity and respectability among those whose opinions carried the power to make or destroy reputations that had been generations in the building and could be lost in a single season's worth of scandal or social misstep that marked the difference between acceptance and exile from the only world they had ever known or valued as the measure of their worth and identity as members of the privileged class, whose responsibilities extended far beyond personal satisfaction to encompass the welfare of all those who depended upon their continued stability and success for their own security and prosperity, in an uncertain world where fortunes could change as quickly as fashions, and where only the most careful navigation of social and financial obligations could ensure the survival of great houses and ancient names through the challenges that each generation faced in their turn as inheritors of both privilege and responsibility that came with elevated birth and the expectations that accompanied such advantages in a society that demanded excellence from those who enjoyed its greatest rewards and showed little mercy to those who failed to meet the standards established by centuries of aristocratic tradition and obligation. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of Ashworth House as Theodore approached the familiar entrance with the determined stride of a man who had finally decided to abandon the careful, emotional distance that had characterized his previous visits to his betrothed's residence, his mind occupied with thoughts of how he might bridge the growing chasm that had opened between them, following their disastrous encounter at the Pemberton soiree, where something had clearly transpired to shatter whatever fragile understanding they had been building, despite their mutual determination to maintain purely practical arrangements regarding their upcoming marriage. He had spent the sleepless hours since her abrupt departure from the evening's entertainment wrestling with emotions he barely recognized, let alone understood. Finding himself increasingly disturbed by the memory of her pale face and obvious distress as she announced her sudden headache and need for immediate departure from festivities that she had seemed to be enjoying until some unspecified moment when her demeanor had transformed from polite engagement to barely concealed anguish that suggested circumstances far more serious than mere social fatigue or feminine vapors. The butler who answered his knock carried an expression of barely controlled panic that immediately set Theo's nerves on edge, while the unusual bustle of activity visible through the partially opened doors to the morning room and library suggested a household in complete disarray rather than the ordered calm that typically characterized the Ashworth establishment under Mrs. Ashworth's experienced management and Seraphina's efficient oversight of daily operations. "Your Grace," the elderly servant began with obvious reluctance, his voice trembling slightly as he struggled to find words adequate to convey news that would undoubtedly shock and distress the Duke, whose regular visits had become an expected part of their daily routine since the engagement announcement had made him an anticipated member of their extended family circle. "I regret to inform you that Miss Ashworth is not available to receive callers this morning, nor indeed will she be available for the foreseeable future, as she has departed London quite suddenly during the night, without providing specific details regarding her destination or expected duration of her absence from the household that has been her primary residence since her father's untimely death several years past." The man's carefully chosen words carried implications that struck Theo like physical blows. Though he found himself struggling to comprehend the full meaning of what was being communicated with such obvious reluctance, by someone whose loyalty to the Ashworth family had been tested by circumstances that clearly exceeded his understanding or ability to manage according to the established protocols that governed such unprecedented situations as the sudden disappearance of an engaged young lady from her family home without explanation or apparent destination to guide those who might wish to follow or communicate with her regarding matters of mutual concern and obligation. Mrs. Ashworth received him in her private sitting room with the composed dignity of a woman determined to maintain appearances despite circumstances that threatened to destroy everything she had worked to preserve regarding her family's reputation and standing within a society that showed little mercy to those whose personal dramas became subjects of public speculation and gossip among the entertainment-starved members of London's most exclusive social circles. Her pale complexion and obvious exhaustion revealed the extent of her distress, despite her careful attention to proper dress and deportment, while the tremor in her hands as she gestured for him to be seated spoke of emotions barely held in check by years of aristocratic training in the management of crisis without public display of weakness or uncertainty that might encourage further investigation by those who thrived on scandal and misfortune among their social superiors. She spoke of visiting distant relatives with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed explanations that satisfied the basic requirements of social convention without providing sufficient detail to allow verification or contradiction by those who might question the suddenness of such travel arrangements or the apparent lack of correspondence regarding plans that should have been discussed and arranged well in advance of any actual departure from London during the height of the social season, when young ladies of marriageable age were expected to maintain constant availability for the various obligations and entertainments that comprised their primary occupation and responsibility. "Your Grace," Mrs. Ashworth began with obvious difficulty, her voice carrying the weight of genuine maternal concern beneath its carefully modulated tones of aristocratic composure. "I must confess that my daughter's sudden departure has surprised me as much as it has clearly surprised you, though I fear I can provide little additional information beyond her expressed desire to spend time in quiet reflection away from the pressures and obligations that have consumed her attention since your engagement was announced to a society that has shown perhaps excessive interest in the private affairs of two individuals whose business should remain their own concern rather than becoming fodder for public entertainment and speculation. She had mentioned the possibility of visiting relatives in the North Country, where the pace of life allows for the sort of contemplation that London's constant social demands make nearly impossible for young women whose every appearance and action become subjects of intense scrutiny from those who have little better occupation than monitoring the romantic affairs of their social equals or supposed betters. Though she provided no specific details regarding her intended destination or the duration of her planned absence from obligations that include not only our family's various commitments, but also the numerous arrangements that require attention as your wedding approaches, with all the accompanying expectations for perfection in every detail of ceremony and celebration that befits an alliance between families of our respective positions in society's carefully maintained hierarchy of precedence and influence. The search that began immediately upon Theo's departure from Ashworth House consumed every hour of his existence with an intensity that surprised both himself and those who observed his transformation from the languidly elegant Duke, who had previously approached every challenge with aristocratic insouciance, to a man driven by desperation that bordered on obsession as he pursued every possible lead regarding Seraphina's whereabouts, with the determination of someone whose very survival depended upon locating the woman who had vanished from his life as suddenly and completely as if she had never existed beyond his increasingly tormented imagination. He dispatched riders to every coaching inn within 50 miles of London with detailed descriptions and generous rewards for any information regarding a young lady travelling alone or with minimal accompaniment who might have purchased passage to destinations north of the capital, while his own investigations took him personally to locations that included posting houses, private establishments that catered to genteel travellers seeking discretion, and even the less reputable establishments where desperate individuals might seek temporary refuge from circumstances that made conventional accommodations impossible or inadvisable for reasons that respectable society preferred not to acknowledge or investigate too closely. Lady Constance proved equally mystified by her friend's sudden departure, able only to confirm that Seraphina had seemed increasingly distressed during the final hours of the Pemberton soirée, though she had been unable to determine the specific cause of that distress, despite several attempts to engage her in private conversation that might have revealed whatever crisis had prompted such dramatic action as abandoning her established life without explanation or apparent regard for the consequences such behavior would inevitably bring to both her own reputation and that of her family, whose standing in society depended largely upon their ability to maintain appearances of stability and respectability, regardless of private difficulties or personal challenges that tested their resolve and resourcefulness. The servants at Ashworth House could provide no additional insights beyond their observation that Miss Ashworth had retired to her chambers at the usual hour following her return from the evening's entertainment, but had apparently departed sometime during the night with only a single travelling bag, and without disturbing the household staff, whose assistance would normally have been required for any journey requiring more extensive preparation or accommodation arrangements that might have provided clues about her intended destination or the circumstances that had prompted such sudden and secretive travel plans, that suggested either extreme urgency or deliberate concealment of information that might have allowed those who cared about her welfare to offer assistance or at least reassurance regarding her safety and well-being in whatever situation she had chosen to embrace, rather than remaining in London to face whatever crisis had driven her to such desperate measures. As days stretched into weeks without any credible reports of Seraphina's whereabouts, despite increasingly extensive and expensive investigations that had expanded to cover most of England's major cities and many smaller communities, where a young lady of quality might seek temporary refuge among family connections or sympathetic acquaintances willing to provide shelter without asking uncomfortable questions about the circumstances that had necessitated such arrangements. Theodore found himself consumed by emotions that he had never experienced with such overwhelming intensity, and that challenged every assumption he had made about his own character and capacity for attachment to another human being whose welfare had somehow become more important to his peace of mind than any personal consideration or social obligation that had previously commanded his attention and energy. His brother Percy observed this transformation with growing concern that extended beyond mere fraternal worry about erratic behavior to encompass genuine fear that Theo's obsession with locating his missing fiancée was destroying his judgment and his ability to manage the practical responsibilities that required constant attention from someone in his elevated position within both society and the complex financial and political networks that sustained the Ravens Hollow influence and prosperity across multiple counties and commercial enterprises that depended upon ducal leadership for their continued success and stability. Alexander, who had initially found considerable amusement in his friend's obvious distress over the disappearance of a woman whose engagement had been accomplished through what he still believed to be superior masculine charm and strategic timing rather than genuine emotional attachment, gradually began to recognize signs that suggested depths of feeling far beyond anything he had previously suspected Theo capable of experiencing, leading to increasingly serious conversations about the true nature of the Duke's interest in a woman whose absence was affecting him with an intensity that spoke of love rather than mere wounded pride or aristocratic annoyance at being denied something he had claimed as his rightful possession through the successful completion of their original wager. "You love her," Alexander observed during one of their increasingly frequent discussions about the search efforts that had yielded nothing but false leads and mounting frustration, despite the considerable resources being devoted to an investigation that had expanded far beyond anything that conventional concern for a missing fiancé would justify, his words carrying the weight of revelation that neither man had been prepared to acknowledge, despite growing evidence that Theo's attachment to Seraphina Ashworth transcended every rational explanation for his behavior, since her disappearance had transformed his ordered existence into chaos that threatened to consume not only his peace of mind, but also his ability to function as the Duke of Ravenshollow, whose responsibilities extended far beyond personal happiness to encompass the welfare of thousands of people whose livelihoods depended upon his continued effectiveness as their protector and provider in an uncertain world where aristocratic leadership remained essential to the stability and prosperity of entire communities, whose fate rested in the hands of men whose personal struggles could never be allowed to interfere with their public obligations regardless of the private cost. Such devotion to duty might exact from those who bore the burden of hereditary privilege and its accompanying responsibilities, to generations past and future who had sacrificed and would sacrifice everything for the preservation of great names and ancient traditions that defined the very essence of their identity and purpose in a rapidly changing world that challenged every assumption about the proper relationship between individual desire and collective obligation that had guided aristocratic behavior for centuries beyond memory or historical record. Meanwhile, whispers began to circulate through London's drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs with the relentless persistence of wildfire spreading through drought-stricken countryside, carrying speculation and rumor that grew more elaborate and damaging with each repetition as society's appetite for scandal found fresh nourishment in the mysterious disappearance of Miss Seraphina Ashworth and the Duke of Ravenshollow's increasingly frantic efforts to locate his missing fiancée, despite official statements from both families that suggested merely temporary separation due to family obligations that required her immediate attention in locations that remained diplomatically vague in their geographic specificity. Some suggested that Miss Ashworth had fled to escape a loveless marriage that had been arranged for financial considerations rather than romantic attachment. A theory that gained credibility from observations about the couple's formal behavior during their few public appearances together, and the obvious lack of the sort of intimate glances and private conversations that typically characterized genuinely affectionate couples during their engagement period. When passion should be at its peak intensity before settling into the comfortable companionship that supposedly sustained successful marriages through the inevitable challenges that tested even the strongest bonds between husband and wife. Others whispered about hidden scandals that might have prompted such dramatic action as abandoning established social position and family obligations without explanation or apparent regard for consequences that would inevitably follow from behavior that violated every convention governing appropriate conduct for young ladies of elevated birth and carefully maintained reputation, whose every action reflected not only upon themselves, but also upon their families and the complex web of social relationships that sustained the delicate balance of power and influence within London's most exclusive circles, where reputation once lost could never be fully restored, regardless of subsequent behavior or explanation that might justify past indiscretions or unfortunate decisions made under pressure that respectable society preferred not to acknowledge or examine too closely, lest such investigation reveal uncomfortable truths about the compromises and accommodations that even the most virtuous individuals sometimes found necessary for survival in a world that demanded perfection, while providing little mercy for those whose circumstances tested their resolve beyond human endurance or reasonable expectation of success in maintaining impossible standards of behavior that left no room for weakness or uncertainty in matters where error carried consequences that extended far beyond individual suffering to encompass entire families and generations yet unborn whose fate might hang in the balance of decisions made by individuals whose personal struggles remained invisible to those who judged without understanding or compassion for the impossible choices that life sometimes demanded from people whose circumstances left them with no good options and only the hope that courage and integrity might somehow prove sufficient to navigate challenges that tested every assumption about human nature and divine justice in a universe that seemed increasingly indifferent to individual suffering or collective attempts to impose order upon chaos that threatened to overwhelm every carefully constructed barrier between civilization and the primitive forces that lurked beneath the polished surface of aristocratic society, with its elaborate rules and rigid hierarchies that provided structure and meaning for those fortunate enough to understand their place within the grand design, while leaving others to struggle with questions that had no answers, and dilemmas that offered no resolution beyond the desperate hope that somehow love might prove stronger than circumstance, and that human connection might triumph over the forces that sought to divide and destroy everything beautiful and meaningful in a world that desperately needed examples of successful relationships between equals, who could challenge and support each other through whatever trials fate might devise to test their commitment and their capacity for growth beyond the limitations that society and personal history had imposed upon their understanding of what was possible when two people chose to risk everything for the chance of discovering whether happiness could be achieved through honest communication and mutual respect that transcended the boundaries of class and convention that had historically prevented such alliances from flourishing, despite the obvious benefits that might accrue to individuals and society when artificial barriers were overcome through genuine affection and shared commitment to values that elevated human dignity above mere social positioning or financial advantage in the eternal struggle between love and duty that defined the human condition across cultures and centuries, without resolution but with endless variation on themes that spoke to universal longings for connection and meaning that transcended individual existence to embrace possibilities that could transform not only personal lives but also the broader community that benefited when our exceptional individuals chose to risk conventional security for the uncertain rewards that came with authentic relationships built upon foundations stronger than convenience or tradition could provide, in an era when change came faster than adaptation, and when only the most flexible and courageous individuals could hope to navigate successfully the transition between old certainties and new possibilities that characterized their particular moment in history, when everything seemed possible and nothing seemed permanent except the human need for love and understanding that drove all meaningful action and decision-making, regardless of external circumstances or social pressure that might encourage more cautious approaches to life and its myriad challenges and opportunities for growth and fulfillment that awaited those brave enough to seize them, despite the risks and uncertainties that accompanied any significant departure from established patterns of behavior and expectation that had governed aristocratic society since time immemorial and showed no signs of fundamental change, despite the obvious strains that modern conditions placed upon ancient traditions and assumptions about proper relationships between individuals and communities that had once provided stability but now seemed increasingly inadequate to address the complex realities of contemporary existence that demanded new approaches to eternal questions about love and marriage, and the possibility of achieving personal happiness within social structures that had been designed for entirely different purposes and circumstances than those that currently challenged every thoughtful person who sought to live with integrity and authenticity while meeting the legitimate expectations of family and community that formed the foundation of civilized society and its various institutions that required individual sacrifice and commitment to survive and flourish in an uncertain world where only cooperation and mutual support could provide the security and stability that allowed human beings to develop their full potential as creators and nurturers of everything beautiful and meaningful that distinguished civilization from chaos and gave purpose and direction to existence that might otherwise seem random and pointless in its apparent indifference to individual suffering and aspiration. The deterioration of Mrs. Ashworth's health proceeded with the relentless inevitability of autumn leaves surrendering to winter's approach, each passing day revealing new evidence of a constitution that had finally succumbed to the accumulated stresses of financial ruin, social anxiety, and maternal anguish over her daughter's mysterious disappearance from both London society and the sanctuary of their family home, where she had hoped to provide guidance through the treacherous waters of an engagement that had promised salvation, but delivered only additional complications to lives already burdened beyond reasonable endurance. The physician who attended her during these final weeks spoke in the carefully measured tones of a professional who had learned to deliver unwelcome news with sufficient delicacy to preserve hope while preparing families for outcomes that medical science could neither prevent nor significantly postpone. His daily visits becoming increasingly brief as the available treatments proved inadequate against an illness that seemed to draw its strength from sources deeper than physical malady, to encompass the sort of spiritual exhaustion that afflicted those whose responsibilities had exceeded their resources for so long that the prospect of rest offered more appeal than the struggle required for continued existence. Theodore received the urgent summons to Ashworth House with the sort of dread that accompanies recognition of impending loss, though his concern for Mrs. Ashworth's welfare was complicated by hope that her final conscious hours might provide some clue regarding Seraphina's whereabouts that had eluded weeks of increasingly desperate investigation by professional inquirers and personal searches that had yielded nothing but false trails and mounting frustration over his inability to locate a woman whose disappearance had become an obsession that consumed his thoughts and disrupted his previously ordered existence in ways that defied rational explanation or practical resolution. The elderly woman who greeted him from her bed bore little resemblance to the formidable matriarch who had once commanded London drawing rooms with the authority of someone whose social position had been earned through decades of careful cultivation and strategic alliances that had elevated the Ashworth family from comfortable obscurity to prominence within the most exclusive circles, where reputation and connections mattered more than mere wealth in determining access to power and influence that shaped the destiny of entire generations, whose future depended upon maintaining standards that required constant vigilance and sacrifice from those who understood the precarious nature of social elevation and the speed with which carefully constructed advantages could be lost through scandal or financial reversal that destroyed families with ruthless efficiency. "Your Grace," she whispered with obvious effort, her voice carrying the fragile quality of someone whose remaining strength had been carefully hoarded for conversations that could not be postponed until physical recovery that would never arrive. "I have asked you here because there are truths about my daughter's situation that you must understand before it becomes impossible for me to share information that may prove essential to locating her, and perhaps even to preserving her life, if she has fled to circumstances that place her beyond the protection that her birth and upbringing should have provided, against the dangers that threaten young women whose desperation makes them vulnerable to exploitation by those who profit from innocence and misfortune." The confession that followed revealed depths of financial ruin that exceeded even Theodore's worst suspicions about the Ashworth family's circumstances, with Mrs. Ashworth's halting words painting a picture of systematic deception maintained through years of increasingly desperate measures that had postponed but never eliminated the fundamental reality of obligations that far exceeded resources and had gradually consumed everything of value that could be sold or mortgaged to provide temporary relief from creditors, whose patience had been exhausted long before Seraphina's engagement had offered hope of salvation through marriage to someone whose fortune could absorb their debts without significant impact upon his own comfort or social position. "We are not merely struggling financially," she confessed with the bitter clarity of someone who had finally abandoned all pretense of maintaining appearances that no longer served any purpose beyond personal pride that had become a luxury they could not afford. "We are completely and utterly ruined with debts that exceed the value of our remaining property, by margins that make recovery impossible through any conventional means or reasonable expectation of improved circumstances that might allow gradual restoration of our former prosperity and security. Seraphina has been selling her personal possessions one by one to pay the most urgent obligations and to support our tenants through a winter that has proven harsher than anyone anticipated, sacrificing jewelry that had been in our family for generations and disposing of books and furnishings that held sentimental value beyond their monetary worth, in her determination to meet responsibilities that should never have fallen upon someone so young and unprepared for the burden of managing crisis that would have challenged far more experienced administrators and financial experts. She accepted your proposal, not for love, Your Grace, though I believe she had begun to hope that affection might develop between you despite the practical nature of your arrangement, but because she believed that marriage to the Duke of Ravenshollow could save us all from complete social and financial destruction that would have left us dependent upon public charity or the uncertain mercy of distant relatives whose own circumstances might not permit extended assistance to family members whose misfortune could potentially compromise their own carefully maintained positions within society's unforgiving hierarchy of respectability and influence. When she learned that your proposal had originated as a wager rather than genuine interest in her person or circumstances, her heart broke not from wounded pride, but from the devastating realization that she had been prepared to sacrifice herself for nothing more than masculine amusement, and that the salvation she had hoped to provide for those who depended upon her would never materialize through an alliance that had been entered into for reasons that had nothing to do with the desperate need that had compelled her acceptance of an offer she would otherwise have refused without hesitation or regret. Mrs. Ashworth's trembling hand pressed a sealed letter into Theodore's palm with the urgent intensity of someone whose remaining time could be measured in hours rather than days. Her fading strength concentrated upon this final maternal duty that required her to share information she had hoped never to reveal but could no longer withhold, given circumstances that demanded complete honesty, regardless of personal cost or family pride, that had once seemed more important than the truth about their situation, and her daughter's motivations for accepting an engagement that had appeared to offer mutual advantage, but had instead delivered only additional anguish to lives already overwhelmed by difficulties that exceeded their ability to manage through conventional means or traditional sources of assistance. "These are Serafina's final words before her departure," she explained with obvious difficulty. Her breathing labored as she struggled to complete explanations that could not be postponed until a more convenient time that would never arrive. A letter expressing her love for our family and her belief that her disappearance would free everyone from an impossible situation that she blamed upon her own poor judgment and inadequate preparation for managing circumstances that would have defeated far more experienced and resourceful individuals who possessed advantages that our reduced circumstances had denied her, despite her intelligence and dedication to responsibilities that should have been shared rather than imposed upon someone whose youth and inexperience made success unlikely regardless of personal character or determination to succeed against overwhelming odds. She believed that by removing herself from London society and abandoning the engagement that had promised salvation but delivered only additional complications, she could spare you the embarrassment of association with a family whose ruin would inevitably become public knowledge and would damage your own reputation through connection with our failures and financial obligations that would require years to resolve even with assistance that she no longer believed would be forthcoming, given the true circumstances that had prompted your proposal and her acceptance of an offer that had seemed too advantageous to refuse until she learned the reality behind what she had mistaken for genuine interest in her welfare and future happiness. Her words spoke of finding refuge where her presence could not cause additional harm to those she loved, and where her own shame at having been deceived would not serve as constant reminder of mistakes that had been made with the best of intentions, but had resulted only in increased suffering for everyone involved in circumstances that had spiraled beyond any individual's ability to control or resolve through personal sacrifice or good intentions that proved inadequate when confronted with the sort of systematic crisis that required resources and expertise that none of them possessed, despite their education and social position that had once provided security, but had proven insufficient protection against the financial realities that had gradually eroded every foundation upon which their former prosperity and confidence had been built, through generations of careful management and strategic planning that had finally proven inadequate against forces that individual families could not resist, regardless of their determination or willingness to sacrifice everything for the preservation of traditions and obligations that had sustained their identity and purpose through previous challenges that had seemed insurmountable at the time, but had been overcome through persistence and cooperation that were no longer available in circumstances that had isolated them from potential sources of assistance and had made their situation hopeless, despite their continued efforts to find solutions that might preserve something from the wreckage of their former lives and expectations. The cryptic reference contained within Serafina's letter to finding peace where the sea meets the sky and memories fade provided the first genuine clue regarding her possible destination that Theodore's extensive searches had uncovered, though the metaphorical language required careful interpretation that drew upon his recollections of conversations during their brief courtship, when she had occasionally mentioned aspects of her childhood and education that had shaped her character, and provided her with knowledge and connections beyond the immediate circle of London society that had defined most of their interactions since their engagement had been announced to a world that had no understanding of the true circumstances that had compelled their alliance or the emotional complexity that had developed despite their mutual determination to maintain purely practical arrangements for their future relationship. He remembered her fond references to Miss Hartwell, the governess who had guided her education during the formative years that had established her intellectual curiosity and moral principles, a woman whose marriage to a vicar in a coastal parish had provided her with the sort of peaceful domestic life that represented everything Serafina valued but had been denied through circumstances that had thrust responsibility upon her before she was prepared to manage the complex challenges that had ultimately overwhelmed her resource and led to the desperate measures that had culminated in her mysterious disappearance from all that was familiar and secure in her carefully ordered existence. The possibility that she might have sought refuge with this trusted figure from her past offered hope that had been absent from previous investigations, though the vague geographical references required systematic inquiry into the records of marriages and appointments within the Church of England that might reveal the current location of a woman whose maiden name and general circumstances provided sufficient information for dedicated research by clerks whose cooperation could be secured through generous compensation and aristocratic influence that opened doors otherwise closed to private inquirers whose motives might be questioned by officials protective of personal privacy and clerical confidentiality. The trail that emerged from careful investigation of ecclesiastical records and marriage announcements in provincial newspapers led ultimately to Whitby, Yorkshire, where the former Miss Hartwell had indeed become Mrs. Davies through marriage to a vicar whose small but comfortable living provided the sort of modest security that had attracted a woman whose experience with aristocratic households had given her realistic expectations about happiness that could be achieved through love and companionship, rather than wealth and social prominence, that often proved insufficient compensation for the absence of genuine affection and mutual respect between marriage partners whose unions had been arranged for reasons that had little to do with personal compatibility or shared values that sustained successful relationships through the inevitable challenges that tested even the strongest bonds between individuals whose lives had become intertwined through choice rather than convenience or family obligation that sometimes created marriages that satisfied external expectations while leaving the participants emotionally isolated and spiritually unfulfilled, despite their apparent success in meeting society's requirements for appropriate alliances between families of compatible social position and financial standing. Meanwhile, in the modest vicarage that overlooked the dramatic coastline where North Yorkshire met the restless waters of the North Sea, Serafina had indeed found the anonymity and temporary peace that had seemed impossible to achieve within the boundaries of London society, where her disappearance had become the subject of endless speculation and investigation by those whose curiosity exceeded their understanding of the circumstances that had compelled such dramatic action from someone whose character had previously been marked by careful consideration and dutiful adherence to social expectations that had governed every aspect of her carefully regulated existence. She had adopted the simple name of Sarah Worth for her residence with Mrs. Davies, whose recognition of her former student had been followed by immediate understanding of the crisis that had driven such desperate flight from everything familiar and secure in a life that had once seemed destined for conventional happiness and prosperity within the elevated circles where birth and education provided natural advantages for those fortunate enough to inherit position and responsibility, along with the resources necessary to maintain standards that defined their identity and purpose. Living simply as companion to the vicar's elderly aunt, Serafina had discovered unexpected satisfaction in the daily routines of charitable work among the fishing families whose lives were shaped by the uncertain rhythms of weather and tide, their struggles with poverty and hardship providing perspective on her own troubles, while their uncomplicated acceptance of her presence offered refuge from the complex social calculations that had dominated her existence since assuming responsibility for her family's welfare following her father's death and the gradual revelation of financial problems that had required increasingly desperate measures to postpone the inevitable reckoning that had finally arrived, despite years of careful management and personal sacrifice that had preserved appearances while failing to address fundamental issues that required resources beyond their means to resolve through conventional methods or traditional sources of assistance that might have been available under different circumstances. Her heart remained broken, despite the peaceful surroundings and meaningful occupation that filled her days, the memory of Theodore's grey eyes and the moment of connection they had shared during their waltz continuing to torment her with possibilities that had proven as illusory as every other hope that had sustained her through the darkest periods of their family's decline, when optimism had seemed essential to maintaining the courage necessary for continued struggle against circumstances that had gradually overwhelmed every defense she had constructed against despair and defeat. When news reached Whitby of her mother's death, carried by travellers whose casual mention of London society's latest tragedy struck her with the force of physical blow, Serafina faced the most difficult decision of her life as she wrestled with competing obligations that included her duty to honor her mother's memory through proper observance of funeral rites and her desperate need to maintain the anonymity that had become her only protection against the consequences of returning to a world that would demand explanations she could not provide without destroying whatever remained of her family's reputation and her own hope of eventual peace through obscurity and simple service to others, whose needs were immediate and understandable rather than complicated by the sort of social and financial considerations that had made her previous existence a constant source of anxiety and moral compromise that had finally proven unbearable despite her determination to fulfill every responsibility that had been entrusted to her care by circumstances beyond her control or choice in matters that would determine not only her own future, but also the fate of those who had depended upon her success in navigating challenges that had tested every assumption about duty and sacrifice that had shaped her understanding of appropriate behavior for someone in her position within the complex hierarchy that governed aristocratic society and its various obligations to past and future generations whose welfare depended upon individual willingness to subordinate personal desires to collective needs that transcended immediate comfort or happiness in pursuit of larger purposes that gave meaning and direction to existence that might otherwise seem random and pointless in its apparent indifference to individual suffering and aspiration for something better than mere survival in circumstances that demanded constant vigilance and sacrifice from those who understood their responsibilities to others, whose fate remained tied to their own through bonds of family and tradition that could not be severed without consequences that extended far beyond personal liberation to encompass the destruction of institutions and relationships that had provided stability and meaning for countless generations whose struggles had created the foundation upon which contemporary privilege and opportunity had been built through accumulated wisdom and sacrifice that deserved preservation regardless of immediate cost to individuals whose temporary discomfort seemed insignificant when measured against the permanent value of maintaining connections and traditions that had survived previous challenges and would continue to provide guidance and support for future generations, whose success would depend upon their ability to learn from both the achievements and failures of those who had preceded them in the eternal human struggle to create meaning and beauty in a world that often seemed hostile to such aspirations, despite evidence that love and cooperation could triumph over seemingly insurmountable obstacles when individuals chose courage over comfort and sacrifice over self-interest in pursuit of values that elevated human dignity above mere material success or social position that provided temporary advantages but could not sustain the spirit through the inevitable trials that tested every life regardless of external circumstances or apparent security that proved illusory when confronted with the fundamental uncertainty that characterized human existence in all its various manifestations and possibilities for both triumph and tragedy, that defined the human condition across cultures and centuries without final resolution, but with endless opportunity for growth and understanding that could transform individual lives and communities when exceptional people chose to risk conventional safety for authentic relationships built upon foundations stronger than convenience or tradition alone could provide, in an era when everything seemed possible and nothing seemed permanent except the human need for connection and meaning that drove all significant action and decision-making regardless of external pressure or social expectations that might encourage more cautious approaches to life and its myriad challenges and opportunities. The autumn mist clung to the ancient stones of St. Bartholomew's churchyard like mourning veils, its grey tendrils weaving between weathered headstones that marked centuries of Yorkshire families who had found their final rest in the shadow of the Norman church, where generations of Ashworths had worshipped, celebrated and mourned according to the rhythms of rural life that moved with the seasons rather than the frantic pace of London society that Seraphina had fled in her desperate attempt to escape the consequences of a love that had proven as dangerous as it was unexpected. She stood beside the freshly turned earth that covered her mother's coffin, her figure shrouded in the deepest mourning attire that rendered her nearly invisible among the shadows cast by ancient yew trees whose gnarled branches had witnessed countless scenes of human grief and loss over the centuries. They had stood sentinel over this sacred ground where her family's history lay buried beneath worn stone markers that told stories of lives lived and loves lost to the inexorable passage of time that claimed even the most aristocratic bloodlines, despite their pretensions to permanence and significance in the grand scheme of divine providence. The funeral service had been mercifully brief, attended only by local tenants and clergy who remembered Mrs. Ashworth's kindness during her occasional visits to the estate that had become her daughter's refuge from the complications of a world that demanded more courage than she possessed to face the consequences of emotions that had overwhelmed every rational consideration about appropriate behavior. For a woman whose reputation and family's standing depended upon maintaining the careful composure that had sustained them through previous crises without the devastating scandal that her disappearance had undoubtedly created among those who delighted in the downfall of their social superiors, she had arrived at the church before dawn to avoid recognition by anyone who might carry word of her presence back to London, where her absence had created a mystery that grew more scandalous with each passing week, that brought no news of her whereabouts or explanation for the sudden departure that had abandoned her fiancé and her family obligations without regard for the damage such behavior would inevitably cause to all concerned, though her grief for the woman who had shaped her character and guided her through the complexities of aristocratic life, from childhood through the present crisis, made every other consideration seem trivial by comparison to the overwhelming loss that threatened to consume what remained of her already fractured world. The heavy mourning veils that concealed her features had seemed adequate protection against unwanted recognition during the brief ceremony that laid her mother to rest beside the husband whose untimely death had initiated the series of financial disasters that had culminated in her impossible engagement to a man whose motivations she had mistaken so completely that the resulting humiliation had driven her to abandon everything she had ever valued or protected in favor of solitude that offered the only escape from emotions too powerful and painful to be endured in the presence of those who might witness her complete breakdown of the composure that had been her shield against a world that showed little mercy to those whose circumstances forced them to make choices between dignity and survival, love and duty. Personal happiness and family obligation that tested every principle and assumption about the proper conduct of women whose elevated birth had supposedly prepared them for lives of privilege and protection, rather than the harsh realities that seemed to be the only inheritance available to those whose fathers had failed to provide adequate financial foundation for their families' continued prosperity. In an era when traditional sources of aristocratic wealth were proving inadequate to sustain the lifestyle that society expected from those who bore ancient titles and maintained great houses whose expenses far exceeded their diminished incomes from lands that could no longer support the elaborate establishments that had once been possible when agricultural prosperity and stable social hierarchies had guaranteed the security of established families whose names appeared in the oldest records of English nobility and whose continued prominence had seemed as permanent as the stones that formed their ancestral seats and the traditions that governed their relationships with tenants, peers, and social inferiors, whose welfare had been entrusted to their care according to principles of noblesse oblige that had guided aristocratic behavior for generations beyond memory. The sound of footsteps on the gravel path that led from the church to the cemetery gates penetrated her grief like a discordant note in the otherwise perfect silence of morning worship that had surrounded her private communion with memories of the woman whose death had severed her last connection to the family traditions, and expectations that had shaped every decision of her adult life until the moment when passion had overwhelmed prudence and led to the acceptance of a proposal that had seemed to offer salvation, but had proven instead to be the source of humiliation and heartbreak that had driven her to abandon everything familiar and comforting in favor of exile that promised solitude if not peace of mind in the aftermath of discoveries that had shattered every hope she had allowed herself to nurture regarding the possibility that her engagement might transform from mere practical arrangement into something approaching genuine affection between partners whose intelligence and character might have provided foundation for the sort of marriage that combined social advantage with personal happiness. If circumstances had been different, and their initial encounter had been motivated by honest attraction rather than calculated performance designed to win a wager that reduced her acceptance to the status of a prize claimed through superior masculine charm and strategic timing, that had nothing to do with respect for her character or appreciation of her qualities as an individual worthy of consideration beyond her utility as proof of his irresistible appeal to even the most resistant feminine targets. She did not turn when the footsteps halted behind her, recognizing without conscious analysis the particular rhythm and weight that could belong to only one person whose presence in this remote Yorkshire churchyard represented either extraordinary coincidence or the successful conclusion of a search that had apparently continued throughout the months of her absence from London society, that had undoubtedly buzzed with speculation about the mysterious disappearance of the Duke of Ravenshollow's fiancée, whose sudden vanishing had created exactly the sort of scandal she had hoped to avoid through careful management of a situation that had already spiraled beyond her ability to control through conventional means of social navigation and damage limitation that relied upon maintaining appearances regardless of private anguish or personal cost to those who bore responsibility for protecting family. Honor against the consequences of individual weakness or poor judgment in matters that affected not only personal reputation but also the complex network of relationships and obligations that connected aristocratic families in bonds of mutual dependence and shared vulnerability to social censure that could destroy generations of careful cultivation of influence and respectability within circles, where acceptance once lost could never be fully restored, despite subsequent efforts at rehabilitation or explanation that might justify past behavior according to standards of understanding and forgiveness that seemed increasingly rare in a society that had grown more judgmental and less tolerant of human frailty, even among those whose elevated position should have provided some protection against the harsh scrutiny that reduced complex personal dramas to simple moral lessons about the dangers of departing from established patterns of appropriate feminine behavior that left little room for authentic expression of emotion or genuine response to circumstances that tested individual character beyond the limits of conventional preparation or social guidance regarding proper conduct in situations that previous generations had not anticipated or encountered in their own progression through the predictable stages of aristocratic life that had once seemed to provide clear direction and reliable support for those who followed established precedents and avoided the sort of innovation or departure from tradition that characterized modern attempts to balance personal fulfillment with social obligation in an era when individual desires had begun to challenge collective expectations with increasing frequency and determination that suggested fundamental changes in human nature or social organization that threatened the stability of institutions that had survived previous challenges through their ability to adapt gradually to new circumstances, while preserving essential elements of continuity and tradition that provided meaning and structure for lives that might otherwise seem purposeless or disconnected from larger patterns of significance and value that distinguished civilized society from chaos. Theodore's voice, when he finally spoke, carried none of the aristocratic authority or casual confidence that had characterized their previous encounters. Its tremulous quality revealing emotions that he had apparently struggled to control during whatever journey had brought him to this remote location where her mother's death had drawn her from the hiding place that had protected her from confrontations she lacked courage to face in the immediate aftermath of discoveries that had transformed her understanding of their relationship, from tentative hope to complete disillusionment about his character and motivations for pursuing marriage with a woman whose acceptance had apparently been valued primarily as proof of his superior abilities in the ancient game of masculine conquest that reduced feminine intelligence and independence to mere obstacles to be overcome through the application of charm and strategic calculation, rather than genuine respect for individual worth or authentic appreciation of personal qualities that might have provided foundation for partnership between equals who valued honesty above social advantage and authentic connection above temporary satisfaction of pride or ambition that characterized so much of the interaction between men and women of their elevated social position, where marriage too often became merely another form of business transaction designed to advance family interests without regard for personal happiness or individual fulfillment that might have been achieved through different approaches to courtship and commitment that honored the humanity and agency of both parties, rather than treating feminine participation as passive response to masculine initiative that assumed success as natural right rather than gift freely given by someone whose choice deserved respect and gratitude, regardless of the circumstances that had prompted such generosity of spirit or willingness to risk personal security for uncertain rewards of emotional connection with someone whose character remained largely unknown despite social prominence and aristocratic heritage that provided credentials but little insight into true nature or capacity for the sort of growth and development that genuine partnership demanded from both participants who hoped to achieve something approaching happiness within the constraints imposed by society and family obligation that left little room for experimentation or departure from established patterns that had guided aristocratic marriage for generations without producing notable examples of personal satisfaction or individual fulfillment that might serve as models for those brave enough to attempt innovation in matters so fundamental to social organization and family continuity. Serafina, he said simply, his use of her given name without formal address suggesting either intimacy that no longer existed between them or desperation that had overcome conventional courtesy in favor of direct appeal to whatever remained of the connection that had briefly flared between them during their waltz at the ball, where everything had begun with such promise before deteriorating into the painful situation that had driven them both to extremes of behavior that neither had anticipated when entering into an engagement that had seemed to offer practical solutions to mutual problems, without considering the emotional complications that inevitably arose when intelligent people attempted to maintain purely business-like relationships while living in close proximity and sharing responsibilities that required cooperation and communication on levels that challenged every assumption about the possibility of limiting intimate contact to formal obligations that could be discharged without reference to personal feelings or individual needs for understanding and acceptance that made human beings vulnerable to each other in ways that transcended social convention or contractual arrangement between parties, whose elevated education and sophisticated understanding of human nature should have prepared them for the complexities that characterized any successful alliance between equals whose intelligence and independence required constant negotiation and compromise to maintain harmony without sacrificing authenticity or individual integrity to the demands of peaceful coexistence within institutions that had been designed for more different purposes and circumstances than those that currently challenged everyone who sought to balance personal desires with collective expectations in an era of rapid change and uncertainty that left even the most privileged individuals struggling to find stable ground upon which to build meaningful relationships that could survive the pressures and temptations that threatened to destroy everything valuable and beautiful that human beings created together when circumstances permitted the sort of mutual support and encouragement that allowed individual talents and capacities to flourish within partnerships that honored both personal growth and shared commitment to values that transcended immediate satisfaction or temporary advantage in favor of lasting significance that might justify the sacrifices and compromises that love demanded from those who chose to risk everything for uncertain rewards that could transform ordinary existence into something approaching the fulfillment and meaning that made life worth living, despite its inevitable disappointments and losses that tested human endurance and faith in divine providence that seemed increasingly remote from the practical concerns and emotional needs that drove most decisions about how to spend the limited time available for creating whatever happiness might be possible within the constraints imposed by circumstances beyond individual control and social expectations that demanded conformity to standards that often seemed arbitrary or outdated in their relationship to contemporary realities, that challenged every assumption about proper behavior and appropriate goals for people whose circumstances differed dramatically from those that had shaped traditional approaches to courtship and marriage in an era when individual choice played smaller role in determining personal destiny than family obligation and social convention, that left little room for authentic expression of preference or genuine exploration of compatibility between potential partners whose future happiness depended upon achieving understanding and mutual respect that could only develop through honest communication and shared experience of challenges that tested character and revealed true nature beneath the polished surfaces that social training created to mask individual vulnerability and authentic humanity that made real connection possible when circumstances permitted the sort of openness and trust that characterized successful relationships between people who valued truth above convenience and genuine affection above social advantage in their approach to building lives together that honored both individual needs and collective responsibilities to family and community, that provided context and meaning for personal choices that affected not only immediate participants, but also generations yet unborn whose welfare depended upon the wisdom and integrity of decisions made by their ancestors, who carried responsibility for creating examples and establishing precedents that might guide future generations through similar challenges and opportunities for growth and development that characterized human existence across cultures and centuries, without fundamental change in basic needs and desires, that connected all people, regardless of social position or historical circumstance, in the universal search for love and understanding, that gave purpose and direction to individual effort and collective endeavor in the ongoing struggle between forces of creation and destruction that shaped human destiny. According to patterns that remained mysterious despite centuries of philosophical speculation and religious interpretation that attempted to explain divine purpose and human responsibility in cosmic designs that transcended individual comprehension while demanding personal participation in activities and relationships that contributed to outcomes whose significance might not become apparent until long after the immediate participants had passed beyond earthly concerns into whatever realm awaited those who had completed their assigned roles in the great drama of existence that encompassed all life and consciousness in patterns of meaning and purpose that provided hope and direction for those who sought to live with integrity and courage, despite uncertainty about ultimate outcomes or divine justice that might reward virtue and punish vice, according to standards that remained largely invisible to those who struggled with immediate challenges and opportunities that tested faith and character, while providing chances for growth and service that made individual existence significant within larger contexts of family and community responsibility that extended across generations and geographical boundaries to include all those whose welfare was affected by personal decisions about how to use whatever talents and advantages circumstances had provided for creating beauty and meaning in a world that desperately needed examples of successful cooperation and mutual support between people who chose to transcend selfish interests in favor of shared commitment to values that honored human dignity and potential for achievement, that distinguished civilized society from chaos and provided foundation for hope that future generations might inherit a world more beautiful and just than the one their ancestors had created through centuries of struggle against ignorance and cruelty that had slowly yielded to expanding understanding and compassion that made possible the sort of relationships and institutions that supported individual flourishing within communities that valued both personal freedom and collective responsibility for creating conditions that allowed human beings to develop their full potential as creators and nurturers of everything meaningful and valuable, that gave purpose and direction to existence in universe that seemed designed to test courage and faith, while providing opportunities for service and love that transformed ordinary lives into vehicles for transcendent significance, that justified hope for ultimate triumph of good over evil in cosmic struggle, that engaged all conscious beings in activities and relationships whose outcomes shaped destiny of all creation according to divine purpose that remained hidden yet active in every moment of authentic choice between selfishness and service, that defined moral character and determined individual contribution to collective welfare that extended beyond immediate circumstances to include responsibility for future generations whose happiness and prosperity depended upon wisdom and integrity of decisions made by those who carried burden of leadership and example in their particular time and place within ongoing story of human development and spiritual evolution that connected all existence in patterns of meaning and purpose that transcended individual understanding while demanding personal participation in creating world worthy of divine blessing and human aspiration for peace and justice that honored dignity and potential of every conscious being. The carriage wheels that carried Serafina back through the familiar streets of London turned with the inexorable rhythm of fate, returning her to a world she had fled in desperation, and now approached with a mixture of trepidation and resigned determination to face whatever consequences awaited her after months of absence that had undoubtedly provided ample material for the sort of speculation and gossip that sustained society's appetite for scandal among those whose elevated positions made their personal dramas subjects of public entertainment rather than private concern. She observed through the window the unchanged facades of Mayfair's grandest houses, where the same families continued their eternal rounds of social obligation and competitive display. Their lives apparently unaffected by her disappearance or the mystery surrounding her sudden departure from an engagement that had promised to be the season's most celebrated wedding before transforming into its greatest scandal through circumstances that remained largely unknown to those whose curiosity far exceeded their understanding of the complex emotions and practical considerations that had driven her to abandon everything familiar and secure in favor of exile among strangers who asked no questions about her past or her reasons for seeking refuge in their simple community, where genuine kindness had proven more valuable than aristocratic privilege or social prominence in providing the peace she had desperately needed to heal wounds that had cut far deeper than mere wounded pride or disappointed expectations regarding romantic attachment to someone whose character she had so completely misjudged, despite her usual ability to discern truth beneath polished surfaces that concealed authentic nature and genuine motivation from those who lacked experience in detecting deception among people whose entire existence depended upon maintaining carefully constructed images that bore little resemblance to their actual thoughts and feelings about the relationships and obligations that shaped their daily lives according to patterns established by generations of aristocratic ancestors, whose wisdom had been gradually corrupted by increasing emphasis upon appearance rather than substance in matters that affected not only personal happiness, but also family honor and social stability within communities that depended upon mutual trust and shared commitment to values that transcended individual desire or temporary advantage in favor of collective welfare and long-term prosperity that required constant vigilance and sacrifice from those who understood their responsibilities to others whose fate remained connected to their own through bonds of tradition and obligation that could not be severed without consequences extending far beyond immediate participants to encompass entire networks of dependence and support that sustained the complex social structures upon which civilization itself depended for continued existence and development toward higher forms of organization and cooperation that honored human dignity while maintaining necessary distinctions of rank and responsibility that prevented chaos without creating injustice for those whose circumstances placed them in positions of lesser influence or material advantage within hierarchies that reflected divine order rather than arbitrary human preference for power and dominance over others whose welfare should have been protected rather than exploited by those whose elevated birth and superior education supposedly prepared them for leadership that served general good rather than narrow self-interest in the eternal struggle between virtue and vice that characterized human nature across all social levels and historical periods without fundamental change in basic tendencies toward either selfishness or service that determined individual character and collective destiny. According to choices made by countless people whose decisions created the moral atmosphere that influenced everyone within their sphere of contact and responsibility. The sensation created by her return to London society exceeded even her worst fears about the reception that awaited someone whose behavior had violated every convention governing appropriate feminine conduct in matters of engagement and marriage, where consistency and reliability were valued above all other considerations by families whose own reputations depended upon maintaining alliances with partners who could be trusted to fulfill obligations regardless of personal feelings or changing circumstances that might make such fulfillment inconvenient or emotionally difficult for those who placed duty above individual satisfaction in their approach to relationships that served purposes larger than romantic attachment or personal happiness within arrangements that benefited entire families and their various dependents whose welfare was affected by marriage settlements and social connections that extended influence and opportunity across generations of careful cultivation and strategic planning. Some members of society viewed her as a romantic heroine whose mysterious disappearance had been motivated by passion too powerful to be contained within conventional boundaries, their imagination supplying details about secret lovers or family tragedies that provided acceptable explanations for behavior that would otherwise have been condemned as simply irresponsible or inexplicably eccentric in someone whose upbringing should have prepared her for managing difficult situations without resorting to dramatic gestures that created additional problems rather than solving existing ones through patience and careful negotiation with all parties concerned. Others saw her as a scandalous figure whose abandonment of her fiancé without explanation or adequate justification had demonstrated character flaws that made her unsuitable for acceptance within circles that valued predictability and social stability above individual expression or authentic response to circumstances that tested conventional approaches to problem-solving in matters where precedent and tradition provided guidance that had proven effective for previous generations who had faced similar challenges without resorting to the sort of innovation or departure from established patterns that characterized modern attempts to balance personal desires with collective expectations in an era when individual rights had begun to challenge ancient authority structures that had previously maintained order through clear hierarchies and well-understood obligations that left little room for confusion about appropriate behavior in specific situations that arose predictably within the normal course of aristocratic life and its various ceremonial and practical requirements. Theodore's public support for her upon her return surprised those who had expected him to distance himself from association with someone whose behavior had embarrassed him before all of London society. His consistent attendance at every event where she appeared demonstrating either remarkable forgiveness or continued attachment that transcended rational consideration of the damage her actions had caused to his own reputation among peers who judged masculine character, partly by ability to manage feminine behavior within acceptable bounds that reflected credit upon their judgment and authority, in matters where social order depended upon maintaining clear expectations about appropriate conduct for both sexes within their respective spheres of responsibility, and influence that shaped community standards and individual behavior according to principles that had evolved over centuries of trial and error in creating stable institutions that supported human flourishing while preventing the sort of chaos that resulted when traditional boundaries were abandoned without adequate replacement structures that could provide similar guidance and support for those who needed clear direction in navigating complex social and emotional terrain that challenged even the most experienced and well-prepared individuals when circumstances required decisions that affected not only personal welfare, but also family honor and community stability within systems that depended upon voluntary cooperation, based upon shared understanding of mutual obligations and benefits that made collective life possible and rewarding for all participants who contributed their talents and energy toward common goals that elevated human existence above mere survival toward achievement of beauty and meaning that justified individual sacrifice and collective effort in the ongoing struggle to create conditions worthy of divine blessing and human aspiration. The campaign that Theodore undertook following Seraphina's return to London represented a complete transformation of his previous approach to courtship and social relationships, abandoning the calculated charm and aristocratic authority that had characterized his earlier interactions with women in favor of actions that spoke more eloquently than words about the depth of feeling that had developed during her absence and had forced him to confront emotions he had never experienced with such overwhelming intensity or such complete disruption of his carefully maintained emotional equilibrium and social confidence. Instead of pursuing direct conversation or formal courtship rituals that would have been expected from a duke whose engagement remained technically intact despite the mysterious circumstances surrounding his fiancée's disappearance and unexplained return to society after months of exile that had provided ample time for reflection upon the true nature of their relationship and the possibilities for future happiness together within marriage that might transcend the practical arrangements they had originally negotiated in favor of genuine partnership based upon mutual respect and authentic affection that could sustain them through whatever challenges awaited couples whose union had been forged in controversy but might yet be transformed into something approaching the ideal that had guided romantic imagination throughout history, despite its rarity in actual experience among people whose elevated social position often made genuine intimacy difficult to achieve or maintain within relationships that served multiple purposes beyond personal satisfaction or emotional fulfillment. He began systematically repaying every kindness that Serafina had ever shown to others throughout her life. From the servants whose loyalty she had earned through considerate treatment during her family's difficult periods, to the tenants whose welfare she had protected through personal sacrifice of jewelry and treasured possessions that had been sold to provide relief during harsh winters when crop failures and economic uncertainty had threatened their survival and forced difficult choices between personal comfort and collective responsibility. That revealed character more clearly than any formal declaration of principles or charitable gesture performed for public recognition rather than genuine concern for human suffering that touched her heart and moved her to action regardless of personal cost or social recognition. When Serafina learned that her family's debts had been paid through mysterious anonymous investors whose generous terms and patient repayment schedules bore no resemblance to conventional commercial transactions or charitable assistance that typically came with conditions and expectations that limited recipients' independence and dignity, while providing help that addressed immediate needs without solving underlying problems that required more comprehensive approaches to financial recovery and social rehabilitation. She began to suspect that Theodore's involvement extended far beyond the formal obligations of their engagement to encompass genuine care for her welfare and that of everyone whose lives had been affected by her family's misfortunes and the cascading consequences of financial ruin that had threatened to destroy not only their immediate household, but also the broader community of dependents whose livelihoods were connected to the estate's prosperity and their continued ability to meet obligations that had been assumed in better times when such responsibilities had seemed manageable within the normal course of aristocratic life and its predictable rhythms of income and expenditure that maintained stability across generations. The revelation of Theodore's systematic generosity toward everyone who had ever benefited from her kindness created emotions that were difficult to categorize within the simple framework of gratitude or resentment that might have been expected from someone whose pride had been wounded by discoveries about the true circumstances of their engagement and whose trust had been shattered by evidence that their entire relationship had originated in masculine competition rather than genuine attraction or authentic appreciation of her character and qualities as an individual worthy of respect and consideration beyond her utility as proof of his superior abilities in social manipulation and romantic conquest that reduced feminine intelligence and independence to mere obstacles to be overcome through strategic application of charm and aristocratic privilege rather than honest acknowledgement of her agency and right to make informed decisions about her own future based upon accurate information about his motivations and intentions regarding their proposed marriage and its implications for both personal happiness and family welfare within arrangements that would bind them together for life, regardless of whether genuine affection ever developed between partners whose initial encounter had been compromised by deception and competitive performance rather than mutual discovery and authentic exploration of compatibility and shared values that might provide foundation for lasting partnership between equals who valued truth above convenience and respect above dominance in their approach to building relationships that honored both individual autonomy and collective responsibility for creating families and communities that supported human flourishing while maintaining necessary standards of behavior and obligation that prevented exploitation and injustice within hierarchies that served legitimate purposes when governed by principle rather than mere power or inherited privilege, that had been corrupted by forgetting its original purpose of service and protection rather than dominance and exploitation of those whose circumstances made them vulnerable to abuse by those who possessed advantages. They had done nothing to earn beyond accepting birth into families whose accumulated wealth and influence had been built upon foundations that included both legitimate achievement and historical injustices that complicated every claim to moral authority or natural superiority over others whose talents and character might equal or exceed those of their social superiors if circumstances had provided similar opportunities for development and expression of human potential that remained largely unexplored and undeveloped among vast populations whose lives were constrained by poverty and ignorance that could be addressed through enlightened policies and generous assistance from those whose advantages created obligations to serve common good rather than narrow self-interest in the eternal struggle between virtue and vice that determined individual character and collective destiny across all societies and historical periods, without exception or fundamental change in basic human nature, that remained capable of either greatness or degradation depending upon choices made by countless individuals whose decisions created moral atmosphere that influenced everyone within their sphere of contact and responsibility for others whose welfare depended upon wisdom and integrity of those who possessed power to help or harm according to principles that either honored divine law and human dignity or violated both in pursuit of temporary advantage that ultimately corrupted everything it touched while creating illusions of success that masked spiritual poverty and emotional emptiness that characterized lives devoted to acquisition and dominance rather than service and love, that alone could provide meaning and fulfillment worthy of human aspiration for significance and beauty that distinguished civilized existence from mere survival in hostile environment, that challenged courage and faith while offering opportunities for growth and achievement, that made individual effort worthwhile within cosmic drama, that encompassed all consciousness in patterns of purpose and development, that connected every being to divine source of life and love, that sustained creation through cycles of challenge and renewal, that tested character while providing chances for redemption and transformation, that made hope possible even in darkest circumstances, when human wisdom seemed inadequate and divine purpose remained mysterious, yet active in every moment of authentic choice between selfishness and service, that defined moral character and determined contribution to collective evolution toward higher forms of consciousness and organization, that honored both individual freedom and universal responsibility for creating world worthy of divine blessing and human love. Lord Percival's intervention in the complex emotional situation that had developed between his brother and Seraphina represented both familial concern for Theodore's obvious suffering during her absence and practical recognition that their family's reputation and future stability might depend upon resolving the misunderstandings and wounded feelings that had driven two intelligent people to abandon what appeared to be their best hope for personal happiness in favor of pride and mistrust that prevented honest communication about emotions and intentions that might have bridged the gap between them if either had possessed sufficient courage to risk vulnerability in pursuit of authentic connection that transcended social convention and personal fear of rejection or betrayal that had been reinforced by their unfortunate beginning in deception and competitive performance rather than genuine attraction and mutual respect. His decision to reveal the true circumstances surrounding the original wager came from observing the depth of his brother's transformation from careless aristocrat to a man consumed by love he finally understood but lacked skill to express in ways that could overcome the barriers created by past mistakes and current misunderstandings about motivations and feelings that remained largely unexpressed despite their obvious intensity and potential for creating happiness that might justify the risks and sacrifices required for building authentic relationship between equals, who valued truth above comfort and growth above security in their approach to partnership, that honored both individual development and shared commitment to values that elevated human dignity above mere social position or material advantage. "Miss Ashworth," he said during their carefully arranged private conversation in the Ashworth morning room, where she received him with the formal courtesy that had characterized all her interactions with Theodore's family since her return to London society, that buzzed with speculation about her relationship with the Duke and the possibilities for reconciliation or permanent separation that would determine not only their personal futures, but also the social consequences of an engagement that had become public entertainment rather than private matter between two people whose business should have remained their own concern. "My brother has never loved before you," he confided with the directness that had always distinguished his character from Theodore's more polished social manner, his words carrying weight of observation and understanding that came from years of watching his older brother navigate relationships with women who had sought his attention for reasons that had nothing to do with genuine appreciation of his character or authentic interest in his thoughts and feelings beyond their utility in advancing social position or securing financial advantage through marriage, to someone whose wealth and title provided access to privileges and opportunities that defined success within their particular social circledom. Alexander's wager was not intended as cruel game, but as desperate attempt to force Theodore to open his heart to possibilities he had rejected since childhood, when our father's cold marriage taught him to view matrimony as duty rather than opportunity for authentic partnership between people who could challenge and support each other through life's inevitable difficulties and celebrations, that required both individual strength and mutual cooperation to navigate successfully without losing either personal identity or shared commitment to values and goals that transcended immediate satisfaction in favor of lasting significance that might justify whatever sacrifices love demanded from those who chose vulnerability over safety and truth over convenient illusion about human nature and divine purpose in creating beings capable of both selfish destruction and generous service. That distinguished moral character and determined individual contribution to collective welfare that extended beyond immediate circumstances to include responsibility for future generations whose happiness depended upon examples and precedents established by those who possessed courage to risk everything for uncertain rewards of authentic relationship that honored both freedom and commitment within bonds that strengthened rather than constrained individual development toward fuller expression of human potential for creating beauty and meaning in world that desperately needed demonstrations of successful cooperation between people who chose love over fear and service over dominance in their approach to building families and communities that supported human flourishing while maintaining necessary standards of behavior and obligation that prevented chaos without creating injustice for those whose circumstances required protection and assistance from those better positioned to provide help that addressed both immediate needs and underlying causes of suffering that could be alleviated through enlightened policies and generous action by individuals whose advantages created moral obligations to serve common good rather than narrow self-interest in eternal struggle between virtue and vice that shaped human destiny according to choices made by countless people whose decisions influenced everyone within their sphere of responsibility and contact. The quiet announcement of their second engagement appeared in the Times without fanfare or elaborate social celebration, a simple paragraph that conveyed the essential facts while deliberately avoiding the sort of detailed description that might have attracted unwanted attention from those whose curiosity about their reconciliation exceeded their understanding of the complex emotional journey that had brought two proud and wounded individuals back together through patience, honest communication, and gradual recognition that their initial attraction had deepened into something far more precious and enduring than either had believed possible during the dark months when misunderstanding and wounded pride had kept them apart despite their mutual longing for connection that transcended social convention or practical consideration of advantages that marriage might provide to families whose alliance would benefit both parties without regard for personal happiness or individual fulfillment within arrangements that served purposes larger than romantic attachment or emotional satisfaction. This time, Serafina's acceptance was given freely without coercion from circumstance or desperation born of financial necessity that had clouded their first engagement with complications that made authentic communication nearly impossible between partners who approached their relationship as business transaction rather than opportunity for genuine partnership based upon mutual respect and shared commitment to values that honored both individual autonomy and collective responsibility for creating something beautiful and meaningful together through honest acknowledgement of their feelings and realistic assessment of their compatibility as companions who could challenge and support each other through whatever difficulties life might present to test their resolve and deepen their understanding of love's true nature and its power to transform ordinary existence into something approaching the fulfillment that made human struggle worthwhile, despite inevitable disappointments and losses that characterized every life, regardless of external circumstances or apparent advantages that provided no guarantee against suffering or protection from the universal human need for connection and meaning that drove all significant relationships and creative endeavors. The courtship that followed their renewed commitment proceeded with deliberate care and attention to building foundations of trust and understanding that had been absent from their original hasty arrangement. Long walks through Hyde Park and intimate conversations in the Ashworth morning room revealing depths of character and shared vision that neither had suspected during their brief initial acquaintance when social performance and mutual wariness had prevented authentic self-revelation or honest exploration of values and dreams that might provide common ground for lasting partnership between equals, whose intelligence and independence required constant negotiation and compromise to maintain harmony without sacrificing personal integrity or individual growth toward fuller expression of human potential within relationships that honored both freedom and commitment in delicate balance that sustained love through inevitable challenges and changes that tested every bond between people whose lives had become intertwined through choice rather than mere convenience or family obligation that sometimes created marriages satisfying external expectations while leaving participants emotionally isolated and spiritually unfulfilled despite apparent success in meeting society's requirements for appropriate alliances. Theodore's revelation of his plans to merge their estates into a model community for their tenants demonstrated understanding of Serafina's deepest concerns about social responsibility and her vision for using inherited privilege in service of those whose welfare depended upon enlightened leadership from families, whose advantages created moral obligations to serve common good rather than narrow self-interest in the eternal struggle between virtue and vice that shaped human destiny according to individual choices about how to use whatever talents and resources circumstances had provided for creating beauty and meaning in world that desperately needed examples of successful cooperation between people who valued human dignity above mere profit or social position in their approach to managing relationships with those whose circumstances made them vulnerable to exploitation or neglect by those who possessed power without understanding its proper purpose or divine origin in service rather than dominance. Serafina's sharing of her own vision for schools and charitable works that would provide education and opportunity for children whose potential might otherwise remain undeveloped due to poverty or social barriers that limited access to knowledge and advancement beyond circumstances of birth, revealed depth of commitment to social justice that matched Theodore's growing awareness of his responsibility to use ducal authority and resources for purposes that elevated human condition rather than merely preserving aristocratic privilege without regard for its impact upon those whose labor and loyalty sustained the complex systems that maintained great houses and their various enterprises across multiple counties and commercial ventures. Together they designed marriage plans that represented true partnership built upon shared values and mutual respect rather than conventional arrangements that typically assigned separate spheres of influence to husband and wife. According to traditional gender roles that often prevented full utilization of individual talents and insights that might contribute to family welfare and community benefit, when both partners were encouraged to participate according to their abilities and interests rather than predetermined limitations based upon assumptions about proper feminine behavior that restricted women's involvement in matters affecting their own welfare and that of their children and dependents. Their conversations about the future revealed compatibility that extended far beyond physical attraction or social convenience to encompass fundamental agreement about human dignity and divine purpose that provided foundation for decisions about how to live and what values to transmit to future generations, whose character would be shaped by examples they observed and principles they absorbed through daily interaction with parents, whose relationship demonstrated either healthy partnership or dysfunctional competition for dominance and control that could damage children's understanding of appropriate relationships between men and women in families that served as primary schools for learning about love, trust, cooperation, and mutual support that prepared individuals for successful participation in broader communities, whose stability depended upon voluntary cooperation based upon shared understanding of rights and responsibilities that made collective life possible and rewarding for all participants who contributed their talents and energy toward common goals. When Alexander visited Theodore during this period of renewed courtship and tentative reconciliation with Serafina, his teasing comments about the original wager that had initiated their relationship received a response that surprised him with its maturity and insight into the transformative power of authentic love to change fundamental assumptions about human nature and the possibility of achieving happiness through honest communication and mutual commitment to growth and service that transcended selfish desire for personal satisfaction or social advantage in pursuit of something approaching the ideal that had guided romantic imagination throughout history, despite its apparent rarity in actual experience among people whose elevated social position often made genuine intimacy difficult to achieve within relationships that served multiple purposes beyond emotional fulfillment. I lost that wager the moment I proposed for the wrong reasons. Theodore confided with characteristic directness that had replaced his former tendency toward sophisticated evasion or aristocratic condescension in discussions of serious subjects that required honest acknowledgement of mistakes and realistic assessment of personal responsibility for consequences that had affected not only his own happiness, but also that of a woman whose character and welfare had become more important to his peace of mind than any consideration of social position or material advantage that marriage might provide to families whose alliance would benefit both parties, according to conventional calculations that ignored emotional and spiritual dimensions of human relationship that determined actual success or failure, regardless of external appearances or financial arrangements that satisfied practical requirements while leaving deeper needs unmet and unfulfilled. The Duke of Devonshire's annual ball represented the culmination of London's social season and provided neutral ground where Theodore and Seraphina could meet again as equals who had chosen to risk vulnerability in pursuit of authentic connection, rather than maintaining safe distance. That protected wounded pride while preventing healing and growth that required courage to acknowledge past mistakes and express genuine feelings about possibilities for future happiness together within marriage that might transcend their original practical arrangements to become something approaching the partnership that both had secretly desired, despite their mutual fear of rejection or betrayal that had been reinforced by unfortunate circumstances surrounding their first engagement and her subsequent disappearance that had taught them both valuable lessons about the danger of assumptions and the necessity of honest communication in relationships between intelligent people whose pride and independence made them capable of either great happiness or profound misery, depending upon their willingness to risk emotional honesty in pursuit of understanding that could bridge differences and create lasting bond between partners who valued truth above convenience and growth above security in their approach to love and commitment. The moment when the orchestra struck up the familiar waltz that had provided musical accompaniment to their first dance together created opportunity for symbolic renewal of their relationship on terms that honored both their history and their hopes for transformation of what had begun in deception into something authentic and enduring that might justify the pain and struggle required to overcome barriers created by pride and misunderstanding about motivations and feelings that had remained largely unexpressed despite their obvious intensity and potential for creating foundation upon which lasting happiness might be built through patient cultivation of trust and mutual respect that recognized individual worth while acknowledging interdependence that characterized successful partnerships between equals who chose cooperation over competition in their approach to building shared life together. Miss Ashworth, Theodore said with uncertainty that revealed his recognition of her right to refuse his invitation, and his awareness that their second chance depended upon her willingness to forgive past mistakes while risking future disappointment if his character proved inadequate to sustain the sort of relationship she deserved with someone whose love was based upon genuine appreciation of her qualities rather than selfish desire for conquest or social advantage through alliance with family, whose reputation and connections might enhance his own position within circles that valued appearance above substance in measuring human worth and social contribution. Might I have the honor, he continued with humility that contrasted sharply with the confident assumption of success that had characterized his first approach when aristocratic privilege and masculine charm had seemed sufficient to overcome any feminine resistance to his will and ensure victory in competition with friend, whose skepticism about his abilities had prompted reckless wager that reduced her acceptance to proof of superior social skills rather than recognition of her agency and intelligence that deserved respect, regardless of his ultimate success or failure in winning her agreement to marriage, that would affect both their lives according to choices they made about how to approach partnership, that could either elevate or diminish their individual potential for happiness and meaningful contribution to family and community welfare. The dance that followed took place without audience, except their own hearts, which had learned through separation and reflection to distinguish between performance designed to impress observers and authentic expression of feelings that required no external validation or approval from society that had shown more interest in their romantic drama than understanding of complex emotions and practical considerations that had shaped every decision they made about how to conduct relationship that served purposes larger than personal satisfaction or social entertainment for those whose own lives lacked sufficient meaning or excitement to prevent excessive curiosity about private affairs of others whose circumstances made them subjects of public speculation rather than individuals deserving privacy and respect for their right to navigate challenges, without unwanted interference or commentary from those who lacked complete information about situations that required careful consideration and mature judgment to resolve successfully without causing additional harm to everyone involved. As they moved together through familiar patterns of the waltz, both Theodore and Serafina found themselves able to speak truths that had been impossible to express during their previous encounters, when wounded pride and mutual mistrust had prevented honest communication about feelings and intentions that might have prevented months of unnecessary suffering if either had possessed sufficient courage to acknowledge vulnerability and express genuine emotion rather than maintaining defensive posture that protected against potential rejection while also preventing authentic connection that might have grown into lasting love based upon mutual understanding and shared commitment to values that honored human dignity and divine purpose in creating relationships that elevated individual existence beyond mere survival toward achievement of beauty and meaning that justified whatever sacrifices love demanded from those who chose to risk everything for uncertain rewards of partnership with someone whose character and vision complemented their own in ways that created possibilities for growth and service that neither could achieve alone. His confession of love, born from admiration for her strength and character rather than superficial attraction or social calculation, revealed depth of feeling that had developed gradually through observation of her kindness toward servants, her devotion to tenants, her willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for others' welfare, and her intelligence in managing complex responsibilities that would have challenged far more experienced administrators whose education and resources had prepared them for such duties, while hers had been acquired through necessity and natural ability, rather than formal training in estate management or financial planning that aristocratic sons received as preparation for inherited obligations that shaped their understanding of leadership and service from early age. Her acknowledgement of love despite fear of being hurt again demonstrated courage that had been tested by experience and had emerged stronger through trials that had taught her to distinguish between genuine affection and calculated performance designed to achieve specific goals without regard for her feelings or welfare as individual, whose happiness mattered as much as his own, in any partnership worth creating and sustaining through inevitable challenges that would test their commitment and reveal true nature of bond they had forged through honest communication and mutual respect that provided foundation for trust, without which no relationship could survive. Long-term pressures and temptations that threatened to destroy even strongest connections between people who failed to maintain constant attention to each other's needs and continued growth toward fuller expression of human potential within marriages that honored both individual freedom and shared responsibility for creating families and communities that supported flourishing of all members rather than serving narrow interests of those who possessed advantages. They had done nothing to earn beyond accepting birth into circumstances that provided opportunities, denied to others whose talents and character might equal or exceed their own if conditions had been different, and more just in distribution of resources and education that determined life chances and possibilities for achievement that remained largely unexplored among vast populations whose potential was constrained by poverty and ignorance that enlightened policies could address through generous assistance from those whose wealth and position created moral obligations to serve common good rather than selfish interest. In eternal struggle between virtue and vice that determined individual character and collective destiny according to choices made by countless people whose decisions influenced everyone within their sphere of responsibility and contact, in ongoing creation of world worthy of divine blessing and human aspiration for justice and beauty that distinguished civilized existence from chaos, while providing hope for progress toward higher forms of consciousness and organization that honored both individual dignity and universal connection in patterns of love and service that alone could provide meaning and purpose sufficient to justify human struggle and sacrifice in pursuit of something greater than mere personal satisfaction or temporary advantage in cosmic drama that encompassed all existence in divine plan, whose ultimate purpose remained mysterious yet active in every moment of authentic choice between selfishness and service that defined moral character and determined contribution to evolution of consciousness toward fuller understanding of truth and beauty, that connected all beings in relationships of mutual dependence and support, that made life worth living, despite inevitable suffering and loss, that tested faith while providing opportunities for growth and transformation, that elevated human experience toward divine ideal of perfect love and justice, that served as goal and inspiration for all who sought to live with integrity and courage in a world that desperately needed examples of successful cooperation and mutual care that could overcome barriers created by fear and ignorance while demonstrating possibility of peace and harmony that honored both individual freedom and collective responsibility for creating conditions that allowed all beings to develop their full potential as expressions of divine creativity and love, that sustained universe through cycles of challenge and renewal that tested character while providing chances for redemption and fulfillment, that made hope possible even in darkest circumstances, when human wisdom seemed inadequate and divine purpose appeared hidden, yet remained active in hearts of those who chose compassion over cruelty and service over domination in their approach to relationships and responsibilities that shaped personal destiny and influenced collective evolution toward higher consciousness, that recognized unity underlying apparent diversity in cosmic design, that embraced all existence in patterns of meaning and purpose that transcended individual understanding while demanding personal participation in creation of beauty and goodness, that reflected divine nature and human potential for transformation, that justified faith in ultimate triumph of love over hatred and truth over illusion, in eternal struggle between forces of creation and destruction, that engaged every conscious being in activities and choices that determined character and contribution to welfare of all life, according to principles that honored dignity and potential of every expression of divine consciousness, regardless of temporary circumstances or apparent limitations, that could be transcended through growth and service that connected individual fulfillment with collective welfare in harmony, that reflected cosmic order and divine love. The wedding that took place at Ashworth House during the following spring represented not merely celebration of their love, but acknowledgement of journey they had completed from pride and misunderstanding to genuine partnership based upon mutual respect and shared commitment to values that honored both individual growth and collective responsibility for creating something beautiful and meaningful together through honest communication and patient cultivation of trust that had survived tests of separation and doubt to emerge stronger and more resilient than either had believed possible when they first met, under circumstances that had seemed to promise only practical alliance rather than deep emotional connection that might sustain them through whatever challenges life presented to couples whose union served purposes larger than personal happiness or social advantage in pursuit of something approaching ideal that had guided romantic imagination throughout history, despite apparent rarity of its achievement in actual experience among people whose elevated position often complicated rather than facilitated authentic relationship between equals, who possessed intelligence and independence that required careful balance between individual autonomy and shared commitment to partnership that honored both freedom and obligation in delicate harmony, that characterized successful marriages between people who valued growth over security and truth over convenience in their approach to love and commitment. As they took their wedding waltz before assembled family and friends whose presence testified to community support for union that had overcome significant obstacles to reach fruition in ceremony, that blessed not only their personal happiness, but also their dedication to service and leadership that would benefit all those whose lives were affected by decisions they made about how to use inherited privilege and resources in ways that elevated human condition rather than merely preserving aristocratic advantage without regard for its impact upon broader community, whose welfare depended upon enlightened policies and generous assistance from those whose circumstances provided opportunities for either selfish accumulation or virtuous distribution of wealth and influence according to principles that served divine purpose rather than narrow human interest in competition for dominance and control. Serafina reflected upon distance they had traveled from first dance that had initiated relationship through deception and masculine competition to current moment when their partnership was founded upon authentic affection and mutual commitment to shared vision of marriage that represented true collaboration between equals whose different strengths complemented each other in service of goals that neither could achieve alone through individual effort, however dedicated or well-intentioned their attempts might be to create meaningful change in world that required cooperation and mutual support to address complex problems that challenged every assumption about human nature and social organization, while providing opportunities for innovation and progress toward more just and beautiful forms of community that honored dignity and potential of every member rather than serving interests of privileged few whose advantages had been built upon historical injustices that could be addressed through enlightened policies and generous action by those who recognized their moral obligations to serve common good rather than selfish interest in eternal struggle between virtue and vice that determined individual character and collective destiny, according to choices made by countless people whose decisions influenced everyone within their sphere of responsibility and contact. "Do you regret it?" Theodore asked as they moved through familiar patterns that had acquired deeper meaning through repetition in different circumstances that revealed how much both had changed since first encounter, when pride and defensive caution had prevented honest acknowledgement of attraction and compatibility that might have spared them months of unnecessary suffering if either had possessed courage to express genuine feelings rather than maintaining polite distance that protected against vulnerability, while also preventing growth and connection that required risk and trust to develop into lasting love. "The wager that brought us together," he continued with characteristic directness that had replaced his former tendency toward sophisticated evasion in discussions of serious subjects that demanded honest acknowledgement of past mistakes and realistic assessment of personal responsibility for consequences that had affected not only their own happiness, but also welfare of others whose lives were connected to their choices about how to conduct relationship, that served purposes larger than individual satisfaction or social entertainment. For observers whose curiosity exceeded their understanding of complex emotions and practical considerations that shaped every decision about how to approach partnership between equals who valued authenticity above appearance and substance above style in their commitment to building something worthy of the love they had discovered through patient perseverance, despite significant obstacles that might have defeated less determined or less compatible individuals whose characters lacked either strength to endure separation or flexibility to adapt and grow through experiences that tested every assumption about human nature and possibilities for happiness within marriages that honored both individual freedom and shared responsibility for creating families and communities that supported flourishing of all members rather than serving narrow interests of those who possessed temporary advantages over others whose circumstances required protection and assistance from those better positioned to provide help that addressed both immediate needs and underlying causes of suffering that enlightened policies could alleviate through cooperation and mutual care that recognized fundamental interdependence of all human welfare in systems that functioned according to moral principles rather than mere power or inherited privilege that had been corrupted by forgetting its original purpose of service rather than domination in relationships between those who possessed authority and those who depended upon wise and just exercise of that authority for their security and opportunity to develop individual potential within communities that valued human dignity above material success, or social position in measuring worth and contribution to collective welfare that extended across generations and geographical boundaries to include all those whose fate was affected by decisions made by individuals whose choices created moral atmosphere that influenced everyone within their reach and responsibility. The scene that concluded their story took place 5 years later in the estate office, where Theodore and Serafina worked together as true partners in managing properties that had become model of enlightened administration and social responsibility, their twin children playing at their feet. While outside their window, the prosperous farms and happy tenants provided visible testimony to power of love that had begun in deception but had flourished through commitment to truth and mutual service that elevated their individual existence toward something approaching the fulfillment that made human struggle worthwhile despite inevitable challenges and disappointments that tested every relationship between people whose lives had become intertwined through choice rather than mere convenience or family obligation that sometimes created marriages, satisfying external expectations while leaving participants emotionally isolated and spiritually unfulfilled, despite apparent success in meeting society's requirements for appropriate alliances between families of compatible social position and financial standing. Their daily collaboration in addressing complex issues of estate management, tenant welfare, and charitable endeavors demonstrated practical application of principles they had discovered through their difficult courtship and gradual recognition that genuine partnership required both individual growth and mutual accommodation to create harmony that honored different strengths while serving shared vision of marriage as opportunity for service and leadership that benefited broader community whose welfare depended upon enlightened policies and generous assistance from those whose circumstances provided resources and authority that could be used either for selfish accumulation or virtuous distribution according to moral principles that served divine purpose rather than narrow human interest in competition for dominance and control over others whose dignity deserved respect regardless of temporary circumstances or apparent limitations that could be transcended through education and opportunity provided by those who recognized their obligations to serve common good rather than personal advantage in eternal struggle between virtue and vice that determined individual character and collective destiny according to choices made by countless people whose decisions influenced everyone within their sphere of responsibility and contact in ongoing creation of world worthy of divine blessing and human aspiration for justice and beauty that distinguished civilized existence from chaos, while providing hope for progress toward higher forms of consciousness and organization that honored both individual freedom and universal connection in patterns of love and service that alone could provide meaning and purpose sufficient to justify human effort and sacrifice in pursuit of something greater than mere personal satisfaction or temporary advantage in cosmic drama that encompassed all existence in divine plan, whose ultimate purpose remained mysterious yet active in every moment of authentic choice between selfishness and service, that defined moral character and determined contribution to evolution of consciousness toward fuller understanding of truth and beauty that connected all beings in relationships of mutual dependence and support that made life worth living. Despite inevitable suffering and loss that tested faith while providing opportunities for growth and transformation that elevated human experience toward divine ideal of perfect love and justice that served as goal and inspiration for all who sought to live with integrity and courage in a world that desperately needed examples of successful cooperation and mutual care that could overcome barriers created by fear and ignorance, while demonstrating possibility of peace and harmony that honored both individual dignity and collective responsibility for creating conditions that allowed all beings to develop their full potential as expressions of divine creativity and love that sustained universe through cycles of challenge and renewal that tested character while providing chances for redemption and fulfillment that made hope possible even in darkest circumstances, when human wisdom seemed inadequate and divine purpose appeared hidden, yet remained active in hearts of those who chose compassion over cruelty and service over domination in their approach to relationships and responsibilities that shaped personal destiny and influenced collective evolution toward higher consciousness that recognized unity. Underlying apparent diversity in cosmic design that embraced all existence in patterns of meaning and purpose that transcended individual understanding while demanding personal participation in creation of beauty and goodness that reflected divine nature and human potential for transformation, that justified faith in ultimate triumph of love over hatred and truth over illusion in eternal struggle between forces of creation and destruction, that engaged every conscious being in activities and choices that determined character and contribution to welfare of all life according to principles that honored dignity and potential of every expression of divine consciousness, regardless of temporary circumstances or apparent limitations that could be transcended through growth and service, that connected individual fulfillment with collective welfare. In harmony that reflected cosmic order and divine love that provided foundation and purpose for all meaningful human endeavor and relationship in world that desperately needed examples of what was possible when people chose courage over fear and love over selfishness in their approach to life, and its myriad opportunities for creating beauty and meaning that distinguished existence from mere survival, while providing hope for future generations whose happiness would depend upon examples and precedents established by those who possessed courage to risk everything for uncertain rewards of authentic relationship that honored both freedom and commitment within bonds that strengthened rather than constrained individual development toward fuller expression of human potential for love and service, that alone could justify the struggles and sacrifices that love demanded from those who chose to build something worthy of their highest aspirations and deepest values in partnership, that reflected divine design for human relationship and community that served eternal purposes while meeting temporal needs for security and meaning that made ordinary existence extraordinary. Through love that transformed everything it touched according to patterns established by divine wisdom that worked through human hearts and minds to create conditions worthy of blessing and hope for all who participated in ongoing creation of world that honored dignity and potential of every being while serving ultimate good that transcended individual understanding, yet demanded personal commitment and service in pursuit of something greater than self that provided purpose and direction for lives that might otherwise seem random and meaningless in apparent indifference of universe to human suffering, and aspiration for beauty and truth that distinguished conscious beings from unconscious matter in cosmic drama that engaged all existence in eternal struggle between love and fear, that determined destiny of all creation according to choices made by individual consciousnesses whose decisions influenced collective evolution toward either greater harmony or deeper chaos, depending upon their willingness to choose service over selfishness and cooperation over competition, approach to relationships and responsibilities that shaped both personal character and universal destiny.